She was declared dead before she ever drew blood. The newspapers ran the headline. The radio broadcasts confirmed it. The German High Command, on more than one occasion, told the world that HMS Ark Royal had been sent to the bottom of the sea, and the world, briefly, believed them. There was just one problem. She was still very much alive, still cutting through the grey Atlantic, still launching aircraft into storm-clouded skies, still fighting. There is something about a ship that refuses to die that captures something deep in the human imagination, not the triumph of steel and machinery, but the quiet stubbornness of survival. The way a thing continues when everything around it insists that it should not. HMS Ark Royal was that kind of ship. She was not just a weapons platform or a floating airfield. She was a statement, a challenge. An idea made of riveted steel and aviation fuel, and the courage of roughly 1,600 men who sailed her from one end of the conflict to the other. She was the first of her kind, the first large aircraft carrier built from the keel upward, specifically to be an aircraft carrier. Purpose-designed, purpose-built, purpose-committed. Every ship before her had been converted from something else, a battle cruiser hull here, a merchant design there. Ark Royal was born a carrier. She came into a world that was sliding toward its second catastrophic war within a generation, and she was waiting for it, in a sense. Built at Camel Laird in Birkenhead, her keel laid on the 16th of September 1935, she rose slowly over 2 years into a shape that no British warship had taken before. And she carries a name older than the ship herself by 3.5 centuries. Before this carrier, before her predecessor that served in the First World War, before any steel hull crossed the Atlantic, there was a wooden galleon, built for Sir Walter Raleigh in the year 1587, purchased by Queen Elizabeth I for the sum of £5,000, which, as it happened, Raleigh largely owed her already. The galleon was renamed Ark Royal and became the flagship of Lord High Admiral Charles Howard during the confrontation with the Spanish Armada in 1588. That old admiral called the purchase money well spent. 4 centuries of naval history would go on to agree with him. So when we talk about HMS Ark Royal, the carrier, the legend, the warship that twice changed the course of the Second World War, we are talking about something that carries the weight of an entire national identity. The name Ark Royal is not just a designation on a hull. It is a promise. It is a lineage. It is 400 years of the Royal Navy saying, quietly and without flinching, we are still here. This is her story. The full story. The long story. The one that begins in a shipyard in the English Midlands in the mid-1930s and ends at the bottom of the Mediterranean, roughly 40 kilometers east of Gibraltar, in the early hours of the 14th of November, 1941. And yet, because a name survives even when steel does not, it does not truly end there at all. Get comfortable. This one is going to take a while, and it is worth every moment. If you are watching this for the first time, welcome. And if you have come back to this one again because you fell asleep last time and you are not ashamed of it, welcome back. There is no judgment here. History is better heard than hurried. Stay with us. Chapter 1. The Name Before the Ship. 400 years of a legacy. There are warships, and then there are names. A warship is wood and iron and steel, combustible and corrodable, subject to storm and torpedo and the ordinary violence of war. A name is something else entirely. A name accumulates. It gathers, meaning the way a coastline gathers barnacles slowly, quietly, until one day you realize that what you thought was bare rock is something far more layered and alive. The name Ark Royal is that kind of name. It arrived in the English naval tradition in 1587, carried by a galleon built in the Royal Dockyard at Deptford on the River Thames, originally commissioned by Sir Walter Raleigh, a man whose ambitions were always larger than his debts. The ship had been intended simply as the Ark and then, following the custom of the age, Ark Raleigh, bearing her owner's name. But Queen Elizabeth I, practical even in her patronage, purchased the vessel from Raleigh in January of 1587 for £5,000 sterling. The transaction was, in the dry language of Treasury records, largely an offset against what Raleigh already owed the Crown. he received exchequer tallies. Not a single coin of actual money changed hands. Charles Howard, Lord High Admiral of England, called it money well spent. The old galleon was renamed Ark Royal, and she became the flagship from which Howard commanded the English fleet against the Spanish Armada in 1588. What happened in the Channel that summer reshaped the political imagination of Europe and planted in the English national psyche a conviction sometimes dangerous, sometimes earned that British sea power was something providential, something set apart from the ordinary run of military fortune. The Ark Royal sat at the centre of that drama. She did not fire a single decisive broadside. No one engagement turned the entire conflict. But she was the platform, the nerve centre, the flagship, and her name became inseparable from what the English chose to remember as their finest naval hour. The original Ark Royal was eventually rebuilt and renamed in 1608, becoming the Anne Royal, before she was finally broken up in 1636. She was gone, but the name was not. The name was too valuable, too resonant, too thoroughly embedded in the language of English naval pride to be allowed to simply expire. A second vessel carried it in the First World War, serving in a more modest capacity, and when the Admiralty came to name the great carrier they were planning in the 1930s, there was really only one choice available to them. There is something worth sitting with in this history, the idea that a nation would deliberately choose to burden its newest and most powerful warship with 4 centuries of expectation. The name Ark Royal did not say, "Here is a modern fighting machine." It said, "Here is a continuation. Here is something that belongs to a story already in progress." That weight of continuity was, depending on how you read it, either a source of extraordinary morale and pride or a kind of pressure that no ship and no crew could ever fully live up to. As it turned out, the carrier that bore the name from 1938 to 1941 managed to be both. She carried that old name into the worst war the world had known, and she gave it new meaning in the doing. She disappointed no one who believed in what the name stood for. She also paid the price that such ships so often pay, used hard, sent everywhere, spared nothing, until the sea itself finally claimed her. But all of that is ahead of us. For now, just hold the name, feel the weight of it. Ark Royal, a name that sailed against the Armada, a name that flew swordfish biplanes into Atlantic storms 400 years later, a name that still sails today, in one form or another, because some names are simply too good for any one ship to keep to itself. That is where we begin. Not at the shipyard in Birkenhead, not on the drawing boards of the Naval Construction Department in 1934. We begin on the Thames in 1587, with a wooden hull, an unpaid debt, and a queen who knew a bargain when she saw one. The rest, as they say, followed naturally. And nothing about it was easy. Chapter 2, Drawing the Future, Design and Construction, 1934 to 1938. In the early 1930s, Britain was a nation trying to hold 2 contradictory ideas in its head simultaneously. The first idea was that the Great War had been the last great war that the treaties signed in Paris and Washington had arranged the world into something durable enough to prevent its repetition. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had imposed strict limits on the tonnage of capital ships, including aircraft carriers, and the major naval powers had broadly agreed to observe those limits. The Royal Navy planned accordingly. The second idea, quieter, more uncomfortable, increasingly unavoidable, was that Europe was moving in a direction that no treaty was going to hold. The Admiralty had been watching German rearmament with growing concern throughout the early 1930s. It had also been watching the development of carrier aviation in Japan and the United States with professional attention. The Americans were building fast, large, capable carriers. The Japanese were doing the same. Britain's existing carriers, most of them converted from other hull types, were beginning to look dated. The Navy needed something new, something purpose-built, something designed from the first rivet upward to do the job of a fleet carrier properly. The design process for what would become HMS Ark Royal began formally in 1934, working within the constraints imposed by the Washington Treaty limits. Her planned standard displacement was set at 22,000 tons, though she would sail heavier than that in practice. The Admiralty drew up specifications that were, for the time, ambitious. A ship that could carry 60 aircraft, maintain a speed of 31 knots, and provide meaningful defensive armament against both surface and aerial threats. These were not modest requirements. Making them work together within the treaty tonnage envelope required genuine ingenuity from the naval architects tasked with the job. The contract was awarded to Camel Laird and Company of Birkenhead on the English Mersey. Camel Laird was one of the great shipbuilding names of Britain, with a long tradition of constructing vessels for the Royal Navy. Their yard number for the project was 1012. The keel was laid on the 16th of September 1935, and the work that followed over the next 19 months was, by any measure, a remarkable engineering achievement. The most distinctive feature of the design was the flight deck arrangement. Ark Royal was built with two enclosed hangar decks, stacked one above the other, connected by 3 lifts that moved aircraft between the hangars and the flight deck above. This gave her an unusually large aircraft capacity for a carrier of her era. The hangar structure formed an integral part of the hull, rather than sitting on top of it as a superstructure, a design approach that distributed the weight more efficiently and contributed to the ship's stability. The flight deck itself was roughly 240 meters in length, a substantial runway by the standards of the time, though pilots flying some of her heavier aircraft would not always find it generous enough. She was launched on the 13th of April, 1937, in the presence of Lady Maud Hoare, wife of the First Lord of the Admiralty Sir Samuel Hoare. A crowd gathered at the Camel Laird yard to watch the hull slide into the Mersey, a great grey shape, still incomplete, still without her flight deck fittings and much of her internal equipment, but already recognisably massive and purposeful. The fitting-out work continued for another 19 months. She was completed on the 16th of December, 1938, and officially commissioned into Royal Navy service on the same date. Her armament when she entered service included 8 twin mounts carrying 114mm guns for anti-aircraft and anti-surface work, along with multiple batteries of 2-pounder anti-aircraft guns and banks of 12.7mm machine guns. She carried 3 sets of Parsons-geared steam turbines, driven by 6 Admiralty 3-drum boilers, producing 102,000 shaft horsepower and delivering that top speed of 31 knots. Her endurance on internal fuel was, at economical cruising speed, sufficient to cross the Atlantic twice without refueling. These were numbers that would matter enormously in the years ahead. Her complement was 1,580 officers and men, a small city afloat, with all the complexity of organization that such a number implies. Feeding them, housing them, managing the flow of fuel and ammunition and aircraft spares through the ship's systems, maintaining the mechanical health of engines and pumps and electrical systems across hundreds of compartments. This was the daily work of HMS Ark Royal, even before she ever came within range of an enemy. The ship was, in a real sense, an industrial enterprise as much as a military one. She was a factory that manufactured airstrikes, and like all factories, she required continuous and skilled management to keep producing. The total cost of the ship exceeded £3 million, making her the most expensive warship the Royal Navy had ever commissioned at that time. The Admiralty had been cautious about publicising that figure. Britain in the 1930s was not wealthy, and the cost of rearmament was a sensitive subject politically. But the money had been spent, the ship was in the water, and in the autumn of 1938, as Adolf Hitler was securing his grip on Czechoslovakia through the Munich Agreement, HMS Ark Royal was conducting her sea trials off the Scottish coast. She was ready. The war was almost ready. The only question was whether the world was. Chapter 3, The First Shots. Going to War, September 1939. Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September, 1939. HMS Ark Royal was at sea when the announcement came through. She had been at a state of heightened readiness for days, as the diplomatic crisis over Poland reached its terminal stage, and her crew had spent the final weeks of August running through the practical routines of preparing a warship for actual combat, not exercises, not drills, but the particular focused efficiency of men who understood that the guns they were checking might very soon be fired in anger. The atmosphere on board was, by accounts that have survived, less one of fear than of a kind of taut seriousness. These were professional sailors. They knew their jobs. What they did not know yet was exactly how different the reality of war would be from the simulations. The early weeks of the war placed Ark Royal in the western approaches and the North Atlantic, assigned to hunting groups tasked with finding and engaging German submarines and surface raiders. The German Navy had deployed its U-boats immediately upon the outbreak of hostilities, and the tonnage of Allied shipping already being lost to submarine attack in those first weeks was a grim indication of the scale of the problem Britain faced. Ark Royal was one of the heavy assets thrown into the hunting effort, operating as part of a carrier group in waters that were, as events would soon demonstrate, not ideally suited to carrier operations. The ship's first real brush with both danger and history came within days of the war's beginning. On the 14th of September 1939, HMS Ark Royal was operating in the western approaches when she came under attack from the German submarine U-39. The submarine fired 2 torpedoes at the carrier, both missed. Ark Royal's escorting destroyers counterattacked immediately, and U-39 became the first German submarine to be sunk in the Second World War. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one both practically and symbolically. The new carrier had survived her first test, and her escorts had drawn first blood. There was very little time to reflect on this. 3 days later, on the 17th of September, a different kind of blow struck the hunting group. HMS Courageous, another British carrier operating in similar waters not far away, was torpedoed and sunk by U-29 with the loss of more than 500 men. The Royal Navy absorbed this shock and drew the obvious conclusion. Large aircraft carriers were too valuable and too vulnerable to be used as submarine hunters in open ocean, where torpedo attack was a constant risk. Ark Royal was withdrawn from anti-submarine hunting duties and reassigned. The Admiralty had learned something important in those first weeks, at a very high price. What followed through the autumn of 1939 and into the winter was a period of intensive operations in the North Atlantic and the waters around Britain. Ark Royal participated in the hunt for German surface raiders, provided air cover for convoys, and conducted patrols across wide stretches of ocean. The operational tempo was relentless. Carriers in wartime are not resting platforms. They are at sea, launching and recovering aircraft, maintaining readiness around the clock, consuming fuel and aviation stores at a rate that demands constant logistical effort from the support chain behind them. The ship's company learned the rhythms of wartime service quickly and without much choice in the matter. In November of 1939, Ark Royal participated in operations related to the German pocket battleship Deutschland, which had been operating as a commerce raider in the North Atlantic. The Deutschland ultimately returned to Germany without being caught, but the operations mounted against her demonstrated the reach and flexibility that a fleet carrier could provide the ability to place aircraft over areas of ocean too vast for surface vessels to search efficiently. This was what carriers were for, not submarines, not convoy close escort, but the extension of naval power across distances that no surface ship could practically cover alone. The German propaganda machine had already taken note of HMS Ark Royal. By the end of 1939, German state broadcasts had claimed, on at least one occasion, that the carrier had been sunk. The claim was false. The ship was demonstrably, verifiably, photographically alive. But the Germans would make this claim again and again and again throughout the first 2 years of the war. There was something almost compulsive about it, as if the destruction of Ark Royal were not merely a military objective, but a psychological necessity for German naval self-image. She had become, before she had even fought her most important battles, a symbol too large to ignore. The crew, by all accounts, found the repeated reports of their own deaths faintly amusing. There is a certain kind of black humour that develops aboard warships in sustained operations, a way of deflating the melodrama of danger with matter-of-fact wit. These men had survived torpedo attacks, dodged bombs, and crossed some of the most dangerous waters in the world in a state of permanent tactical alertness. Being told by German radio that they were dead was, from inside the experience, mostly just funny. But the year ahead was going to test that humour. Norway was coming. And Norway was not going to be funny at all. Chapter 4, Into the Frozen North. The Norway Campaign. Spring 1940. April of 1940 arrived like a door kicked open. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway on the 9th of April, 1940, in a simultaneous operation of considerable audacity, an airborne assault on key Norwegian cities combined with naval landings at multiple points along the Norwegian coast. The speed and coordination of the attack caught the Allied commands wrong-footed. Denmark fell within a day. Norway's situation was immediately desperate. Britain and France rushed to respond, assembling a hastily improvised force to land in Norway and attempt to reverse what the Wehrmacht and the Kriegsmarine had so quickly achieved. HMS Ark Royal was assigned to this effort almost immediately. Before Ark Royal even arrived in Norwegian waters, aircraft from a different carrier, HMS Glorious, had already struck a blow that would mark a genuine turning point in the history of naval warfare. On the 10th of April, Blackburn Skua dive bombers attacked and sank the German cruiser Königsberg in Bergen Harbour. It was the first occasion in history that a major surface warship had been sunk by aircraft in a combat operation. The age of carrier aviation as a decisive force in naval warfare was no longer theoretical. It had just proved itself in Bergen Fjord. Ark Royal took note, as did every naval staff that was paying attention. Ark Royal herself arrived in the operational area in late April, assigned to provide air support for British ground forces ashore and to attack German positions along the Norwegian coast. On the 25th of April, her Swordfish aircraft, along with aircraft from HMS Glorious, struck the German-held Værnes airfield near Trondheim, causing heavy damage to the facilities there. Subsequent sorties hit merchant shipping at Trondheim, destroyed floatplane facilities, and continued to apply pressure on German logistical lines along the coast. These were not spectacular dramatic victories, they were the grinding, persistent work of tactical air support in conditions that were about as far from comfortable as it is possible to imagine. The Norwegian campaign was defined by its weather as much as by its adversaries. The North Sea and the Norwegian coast in April and May offered some of the most challenging flying conditions in the world: low cloud, frequent squalls, rapidly changing visibility, cold that worked on aircraft systems and human concentration simultaneously. Carriers operating in these waters had to manage the basic problem that flying operations require a certain minimum of predictable weather, and the weather was not always interested in cooperating. Ark Royal's aircrew flew in conditions that would have grounded many other air forces, and did so repeatedly, because the men on the ground in Norway needed whatever air support could be provided. The campaign, however, was not going well on land. Allied forces had landed in Norway with insufficient heavy equipment, inadequate coordination, and the persistent disadvantage of operating far from home supply lines against a German force that had seized the key ports and airfields from the outset. By late May, the decision had been made at the highest levels that Norway could not be held. The Allied forces would have to be evacuated. Ark Royal and HMS Glorious were assigned to cover the evacuation of troops from the Narvik area in the first days of June 1940. It was during this evacuation that one of the most painful losses of the entire Norwegian campaign occurred. On the 8th of June, 1940, HMS Glorious and her two escorting destroyers, HMS Acasta and HMS Ardent, were caught by the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau while attempting to withdraw south toward Britain. Glorious was hit, set ablaze, and sank within 2 hours. Ardent and Acasta were both sunk fighting to protect her. More than 1,500 men died. It was a catastrophe, and it happened in waters that Ark Royal had been operating in just days before. HMS Ark Royal was not present when Glorious was lost. She had already turned south, covering a different element of the evacuation. The near-miss quality of this, the awareness that the same fate might so easily have been Ark Royal's, was not lost on her crew. The sea in wartime operates by a logic that has very little to do with fairness or desert. Ships are saved or lost by the narrowest of margins, by the accident of which route was taken, which course was set, which hour a decision was made. The men of Ark Royal knew this. Every sailor who survived a war knew it. Norway was over. The campaign had failed. Britain had lost ground, lost ships, lost men, and lost something harder to quantify: the confidence that the strategic situation in Europe could be stabilized before it became truly desperate. Within weeks, France would fall. By June 1940, Britain would be standing largely alone against an enemy that controlled most of continental Europe, and HMS Ark Royal, withdrawing southward from the Norwegian coast, was already being directed toward her next assignment, one that would place her at the heart of one of the most morally and strategically complex episodes of the entire war. The Mediterranean was waiting, and the Mediterranean was never simple. Chapter 5: Force H and the Weight of the Mediterranean. Summer 1940. June of 1940 changed the shape of the war. France fell. The armistice between France and Germany was signed on the 22nd of June, 1940, and with it, Britain lost the partner whose armies had been holding the Western land front and whose navy had shared the burden of Mediterranean security. The strategic implications cascaded quickly. The Mediterranean, that ancient sea connecting Britain's imperial lifelines to the Middle East, to India, to East Africa, was suddenly threatened from multiple directions. Italy entered the war on Germany's side on the 10th of June, bringing the Italian fleet into the equation and threatening Allied control of the sea lanes. The French fleet, large and capable, was now in ambiguous hands. Would it fight for the Allies? Would it remain neutral? Or, worst of all, would it eventually be placed at Germany's disposal? To respond to this altered strategic situation, the Admiralty created a new naval formation, Force H, based at Gibraltar, tasked with covering the Western Mediterranean and the approaches to it. HMS Ark Royal was assigned to Force H almost immediately, under the command of Vice Admiral James Somerville. It was an assignment that would define the next 16 months of the carrier's life. Force H operated as an independent command with wide geographic responsibilities, patrolling from the Atlantic approaches to the Strait of Gibraltar deep into the Western Mediterranean, escorting convoys toward Malta, conducting offensive operations against both Italian and, increasingly, German targets. The first great test of Force H, and one of the most contested decisions of the entire war, came almost immediately. In early July 1940, the Admiralty ordered Somerville to present the French naval commanders at Mers el-Kabir in Algeria with an ultimatum: join the British, sail to a neutral port, or be sunk. The French admiral, Marcel Bruno Gensoul, refused all of the offered alternatives. Somerville, deeply reluctant and with his own moral reservations clearly on record, obeyed his orders. Force H opened fire. HMS Ark Royal's aircraft took part in the subsequent operations, which resulted in the deaths of nearly 1,300 French sailors and the crippling or destruction of most of the French squadron. It was an episode that haunted the participants for the rest of their lives. Somerville was profoundly shaken by it. The men aboard Ark Royal, many of whom had served alongside French sailors in exercises and had no particular animus toward France, performed their professional duties and then lived with what those duties had required. History has debated the decision at Mers el-Kabir endlessly. The strategic logic was defensible, the risk of the French fleet falling under German control was real, and the consequences would have been severe. The human cost was borne entirely by men who had, until 6 weeks before, been fighting on the same side. There is no comfortable resolution to that arithmetic. Ark Royal's service record carries Mers el-Kabir in it, and it is only honest to carry it without flinching. Through the summer and autumn of 1940, Force H was in near constant motion across the Western Mediterranean. Ark Royal's aircraft were engaged repeatedly. Italian bomber formations, large formations, sometimes 40 or more aircraft attacked Force H's ships on multiple occasions. On the 9th of July, in operations supporting a convoy, more than 100 bombs were dropped on the fleet by Italian SM-79 bombers. Not a single bomb found its target. Ark Royal emerged from each of these attacks undamaged, her anti-aircraft guns and her own fighter aircraft accounting for the defense. The Germans, watching these repeated failures to destroy a ship they had already publicly declared sunk, were presumably less than satisfied. The defense of Malta through convoy escort was, alongside the hunt for enemy warships, the central task of Force H through this period. Malta's importance to the Allied cause in the Mediterranean cannot be overstated. The island, sitting astride the sea lanes between Italy and North Africa, was Britain's forward base for operations against Axis supply lines. Without Malta, the campaign in North Africa would have been far harder to sustain. With Malta, the Allies could place submarines, aircraft, and surface forces in a position to interdict the flow of German and Italian supplies to Rommel's army. The cost of keeping Malta supplied and defended was enormous, paid in ships and aircraft and men, and the sustained organizational effort of planning dozens of convoys through waters that were almost never safe. Ark Royal's role in this was not glamorous. Convoy escort rarely is. It is the work of presence being there, being watchful, being ready to respond to threats that may or may not materialize, for hours and days and weeks that blur together. Her aircrew flew continuous patrols, her gun crews stood watches, her engineers kept the engines running, her officers managed the 1,000 details of keeping a large warship operational at sea in a war zone. The glamour came later, in the retrospective telling. At the time, it was simply the job that needed doing, and they did it. By the end of 1940, Force H had established itself as one of the most effective independent naval formations in the Royal Navy's order of battle. Vice Admiral Somerville, whatever his personal anguish over Mersal Kebir, was proving to be a commander of considerable skill and flexibility. And HMS Ark Royal, having survived air attacks, submarine encounters, and the moral burden of operations that sat uneasily alongside the cleaner narratives of who was fighting whom and why, was still at sea, still fighting, still carrying the name. The Mediterranean would demand more of her yet, much more. But first, the Atlantic was about to pull her back north toward the largest, most dramatic, most consequential single episode of her entire operational career. The Bismarck was coming out. Chapter 6. The Hunt for the Bismarck. May 1941. Some battles are decided by mathematics, some by logistics, and some, rarely, by a moment so precise that the entire weight of subsequent events balances upon a single point. The story of the German battleship Bismarck and the role HMS Ark Royal played in ending it belongs to the third category. Bismarck sailed from Gotenhafen in German-occupied Poland on the 18th of May, 1941, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen under the command of Admiral Günther Lutyens. The operation, codenamed Rheinübung Exercise Rhine, had a simple strategic objective: break out into the Atlantic, destroy Allied merchant shipping on a massive scale, and demonstrate that German surface forces could reach the heart of Britain's supply lines. Bismarck was the largest, most powerful battleship Germany had ever built. At over 45,000 tons fully loaded, with armour capable of defeating most naval gunfire at combat range, and armament sufficient to match any two Allied battleships in a direct engagement, she represented a genuine threat of the First Order. British naval intelligence was tracking the movement almost from the beginning. The cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk made contact with Bismarck in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland on the 23rd of May and began shadowing her by radar through thick weather. HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales were sent to intercept. The engagement that followed on the 24th of May, 1941, in the early morning hours of that date, was one of the most shocking single events of the entire naval war. HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy and the most famous warship afloat, was hit, almost certainly in a magazine, and blew apart with the loss of all but 3 of her 1,418 crew. Britain reacted to the loss of Hood with something that went beyond ordinary military urgency. This was personal. This was the sinking of a symbol, and the Admiralty's response reflected that. Every available warship in the Atlantic was redirected toward one purpose: find Bismarck, and do not let her reach port. But Bismarck, after the engagement with Hood and Prince of Wales, successfully separated from Prince Eugen and turned for the French port of Brest, where she could shelter under Luftwaffe, air cover, and German shore-based defences. She was making 28 knots southward. and crucially, she had sustained a hit from Prince of Wales that had ruptured a fuel tank and was leaving a thin trail of oil in her wake. On the 24th of May, 9 Swordfish torpedo bombers from HMS Victorious launched an attack on Bismarck in deteriorating weather conditions. Led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, the strike pressed home through anti-aircraft fire and scored a single torpedo hit amidships. It caused a fuel leak, but not serious structural damage. Bismarck kept going. Then, in one of the most agonizing reverses of the entire operation, contact was lost. Radar contact, visual contact, everything. For more than 30 hours, the Royal Navy did not know where Bismarck was. It was an aircraft, a Royal Air Force Consolidated PBY Catalina patrol plane that relocated Bismarck on the morning of the 26th of May, roughly 690 miles from Brest, less than 24 hours from the protective air cover of the French coast. Time was almost completely gone. There was one card left to play. HMS Ark Royal was at sea with Force H, roughly 50 miles from Bismarck's position. She was the only carrier close enough to matter. What happened next unfolded over the course of an afternoon and an early evening on the 26th of May, 1941, and it remains one of the most remarkable flying stories of the Second World War. Ark Royal launched a first strike of 14 Swordfish aircraft. The strike pressed home and attacked the wrong ship. In the driving rain, low cloud, and deteriorating visibility of a North Atlantic storm, the crews had mistaken HMS Sheffield, which had been detached by Somerville to shadow Bismarck, for the German battleship. The Sheffield's captain watched torpedoes running toward his ship and maneuvered desperately to avoid them. He succeeded. The torpedoes ran past, and to their enormous relief, the magnetic detonators on most of the weapons had in any case failed to function in the heavy sea conditions. The Swordfish returned to Ark Royal. The pilots, exhausted, shaken, aware of the near catastrophe they had almost caused, landed on a flight deck that was pitching and rolling in seas that no professional aviator would choose for landing operations. The aircraft were rearmed, this time with contact detonators, the older, simpler type, known to be reliable. The word was passed to every crew: Sheffield is out there. Do not make the same mistake twice. The second strike launched in the early evening, 15 aircraft, into conditions that were, if anything, worse than before. Wind gusting to nearly 50 miles per hour, rain and low cloud reducing visibility to a few hundred meters, the sea throwing 30-foot swells against a hull that was already working hard to maintain its course. The Swordfish found Bismarck. They pressed through anti-aircraft fire from a battleship that was throwing everything it had into the air. In those conditions, with those aircraft, against that target, the flying was extraordinary. 2 torpedoes found their mark. One struck a relatively protected area and caused no decisive damage. The other struck Bismarck's stern, the one part of the ship where armor was thinner, where the rudder mechanisms were most exposed. The rudders jammed, hard to port. Bismarck began turning in circles she could not stop. She was, in the most direct and literal sense, no longer able to go where she intended to go. The Royal Navy closed in during the night and through the morning of the 27th of May. Bismarck was sunk, overwhelmed by gunfire and torpedoes, with the loss of all but around 115 of her crew of more than 2,000. The loss of life was devastating. But the threat she represented to Allied shipping, the prospect of a ship that powerful operating freely in the Atlantic, was ended. HMS Ark Royal had delivered the blow that made the difference. Not the killing blow, the Navy's battleships and cruisers administered that, but the blow that made all subsequent blows possible. The torpedo that hit Bismarck's stern did not sink her, it simply stopped her running. Everything that came after depended on that one strike, in those impossible conditions, by those 15 biplanes launched from a pitching deck into a North Atlantic storm. The Swordfish was a biplane. It had first flown in 1934. It flew at barely 140 miles per hour, which meant that light anti-aircraft fire was, theoretically, fast enough to intercept it. Military theorists, had they been asked in 1935 to predict which aircraft would deliver the decisive blow in one of the Second World War's most consequential naval engagements, would not have selected the swordfish. The theorists would have been wrong. Ark Royal received the news of Bismarck's sinking aboard. The reaction, by accounts that have survived, was quiet rather than triumphant. These were professional men. They knew what they had done, and they knew what it had cost in effort and risk. They also knew, as experienced sailors always know, that the war was not over and the sea had not become safer. There would be more convoys, more Malta runs, more operations in that cold, contested, merciless Mediterranean. There were, in fact, almost exactly 6 months remaining in HMS Ark Royal's operational life. But no one aboard knew that yet. Chapter 7. The Last Months. Force H and the Mediterranean Grind. June to October 1941. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that belongs specifically to sustained naval service in wartime, and it is nothing like the exhaustion of battle. Battle, paradoxically, is energizing in the moment it happens. The body floods with everything it has, the mind sharpens to a single point, the hours compress into something vivid and entirely present. It is the weeks and months around battle, the long patrols, the endless watchkeeping, the mechanical maintenance of readiness, in conditions that never quite settle into routine, that hollow men out slowly and quietly. By the summer of 1941, the ship's company of HMS Ark Royal had been doing that grinding, invisible kind of work for almost 2 years without significant pause. 2 years of high-tempo operations across the Atlantic, into Norwegian waters, across the length of the Western Mediterranean, and then back out into the Atlantic for the Bismarck operation. 2 years of broken sleep, of meals eaten at action stations, of looking at a horizon and calculating how dangerous it was likely to be. The Bismarck hunt had been an extraordinary climax. What came after it was not relief, but more of the same. More convoys, more patrols, more Malta runs, more of the daily business of keeping Britain's Mediterranean position alive. Force H returned to its station at Gibraltar in early June of 1941, and the operational cycle resumed almost immediately. The pressing need, as it had been throughout the preceding year, was Malta. The island's garrison and its civilian population were living under sustained aerial bombardment. German and Italian aircraft flew daily raids from Sicily, which lies close enough to Malta that the flight time barely allowed for a proper approach. Malta's own fighter strength was being steadily eroded, and the only practical means of replacing it was to fly aircraft from carriers operating in the Western Mediterranean within launching range of the island, and then turn back before the escort vessels entered the range of Axis land-based air cover. These operations were known as club runs, and they were among the most regularly repeated and logistically demanding operations Ark Royal conducted throughout her entire service. The mechanics were simple enough in description. Load the flight deck and hangars with whatever fighter aircraft could be provided. Typically, Hawker Hurricanes in this period, fly them off when within range, and hope that the pilots and aircraft arrived in sufficient condition to make a difference. The execution was considerably more complicated. Through June and July of 1941, Ark Royal conducted multiple club runs toward Malta, delivering Hurricanes in numbers that were never quite enough, but were always better than nothing. The island's survival through this period was a close-run thing on a recurring basis, and the calculations made by the commanders involved how many aircraft, how many runs, how much escort, how close to come to the shore-based threat were the kind of calculations that carry the weight of thousands of lives in their margins. Ark Royal's contribution to this effort has sometimes been overshadowed in retrospect by the more dramatic narrative of the Bismarck operation, but the Malta Club runs were in many ways a more complex and sustained commitment. They required coordination between the carrier, her escort, the receiving airfields on Malta, the ferry pilots who flew the aircraft in, and the intelligence apparatus that tried to keep the operational planning ahead of the threat picture. They were never glamorous, and they never stopped being necessary. The Italian Air Force continued its efforts against Force H throughout this period, and continued with remarkable consistency to achieve very little against Ark Royal herself. The carrier had developed, by this stage, an almost legendary reputation among her adversaries for being difficult to hit. This reputation was, in part, simply a reflection of the fact that the Italian bombing tactics of the period, high-level horizontal bombing from formations of medium bombers, were genuinely not well suited to hitting a ship that was moving, maneuvering. The geometry of dropping a bomb from several thousand meters altitude against a target moving at 20 or 25 knots is significantly more complicated than it appears from outside. The margin between a near miss and a direct hit at those altitudes represents an error of only a fraction of a second in bomb release timing, but that fraction translates to tens of meters on the water below. Ark Royal's helm and her anti-aircraft fire together made life difficult for Italian bomber crews, and the results of their efforts showed it. But the German propaganda machine had invested so heavily in the narrative of Ark Royal's destruction, having claimed her sunk so many times, that the claim had become almost self-parodying, that each Italian failure carried an additional edge of frustration. In August of 1941, Force H was involved in one of the most ambitious convoy operations yet attempted in the Western Mediterranean, an effort to push a substantial convoy all the way through to Malta in a single operation with heavy escort. Operations of this complexity required coordination across multiple naval commands and represented the outer limit of what Force H, operating from Gibraltar as its forward base, could reasonably sustain. Ark Royal's role in these operations was the now familiar combination of fleet air defense, anti-submarine patrol, and the provision of fighter cover for the convoy ships themselves. The work was unrelenting. There were nights aboard Ark Royal during this period when the operational tempo was such that aircraft were being launched and recovered almost continuously in rotating waves, with the aircrew rotating between sorties and brief rest periods and then back to sorties again. The engineering department kept the machinery running. The flight deck crews the men who handled and fueled and armed the aircraft, who guided the aircraft to their launch positions and received them on landing, who performed these tasks in all weather conditions on a deck that moved constantly beneath their feet, worked hours that would have caused a pre-war civilian labor inspector to have serious concerns. September and October of 1941 brought no reduction in tempo. Force H continued its Mediterranean operations, and Ark Royal's aircraft were in constant use. The Mediterranean War was, by this point, interlocked with the land campaign in North Africa in ways that made the naval situation in the central Mediterranean inseparable from the fortunes of the Eighth Army fighting Rommel in the Western Desert. Malta was the hinge. If Malta held, submarines and aircraft operating from the island could interdict Axis supply lines to North Africa and make Rommel's operational situation progressively more difficult. If Malta fell, those supply lines would flow freely, and the balance in the desert would tip sharply against Britain. Every hurricane delivered to Malta, every supply convoy that pushed through, was a vote for the former rather than the latter. Ark Royal's club runs were, in a very direct sense, part of the same campaign being fought on the ground thousands of miles away. By October of 1941, HMS Ark Royal had been in continuous frontline service for more than 25 months. She had conducted operations in the North Atlantic, in Norwegian waters, in the Western Mediterranean, in the South Atlantic during the Bismarck operation, and back in the Mediterranean repeatedly. She had survived torpedo attacks, hundreds of bombing raids, the attentions of multiple enemy submarines, and the accumulated mechanical stress of 2 years of high-speed steaming. Her crew had been cycled through leaves and relief drafts as the Navy's manpower situation permitted, but many men had been aboard for the bulk of her service. They knew the ship as well as they knew anything. They knew her sounds and her movements and her moods the way experienced sailors know a particular hull intuitively, in the body, beyond what can be stated in words. There was, however, one persistent concern that had been present among her engineering staff and damage control officers almost since the beginning. Ark Royal had been designed with a layout of compartments and flooding countermeasures that reflected the best thinking of 1935. The problem was that naval architecture's understanding of compartmentalization and damage control had been advancing rapidly under the pressure of wartime experience, and some of the lessons being learned about how ships actually flooded when torpedoed were not comfortable reading for those who knew Ark Royal's internal layout. Her boiler rooms and engine rooms were arranged in a way that, under certain flooding scenarios, could create a rapid and irreversible list before counter-flooding measures could be effectively applied. The naval architects knew this, the damage control officers knew this, the Admiralty had flagged it. There had been discussions about modifications. The discussions had not yet translated into the modifications themselves, partly because the operational tempo never quite allowed the ship sufficient time in dry dock. These conversations, and the quiet professional anxiety that went with them, existed below the level of anything that would have been visible to a casual observer watching Ark Royal operating in October of 1941. To look at her from outside was to see a powerful, functioning warship conducting her operations with the competence and regularity of a well-run military machine. The tension between what she appeared from the outside and what her engineers understood about her internal vulnerabilities was the kind of tension that is only resolved, for good or ill, when the thing that was feared actually happens. The thing that was feared was now 43 days away, and the sea was keeping the account. Chapter 8. The Last Mission. Operation Perpetual. November 1941. The operation that would end HMS Ark Royal's story began like dozens of operations before it. Operation Perpetual was planned in the first days of November 1941 and carried the same basic structure as the club runs that Force H had been executing for the better part of a year. A batch of fighter aircraft, specifically Hawker Hurricanes, would be transported to within flying range of Malta aboard Ark Royal, launched from the carrier's flight deck, and guided to the island by escorting aircraft. The convoy element of the operation involved HMS Argus, a smaller carrier, which would also contribute aircraft to the delivery. Force H would then withdraw westward, back through the Strait of Gibraltar, to its base. It was, by the autumn of 1941 standard of operations, not a particularly unusual mission. The threat environment was well understood. The risks were real, but familiar. The procedures were established. There was nothing in the initial planning that suggested this particular operation would be the last thing HMS Ark Royal ever did. The force sailed from Gibraltar on the 8th of November, 1941. The weather in the western Mediterranean was mixed, not the North Atlantic storm conditions of the Bismarck operation, but the kind of variable autumn weather that created awkward conditions for flying operations without making them impossible. Force H proceeded eastward, maintaining the usual watch routines and the usual vigilance for submarine contact. The waters east of Gibraltar had become increasingly dangerous for surface forces over the preceding months, as the German U-boat presence in the Mediterranean had grown. Earlier in 1941, Hitler had ordered a transfer of U-boats from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, specifically to support Axis operations and threaten British supply lines. The Mediterranean was, in terms of anti-submarine geography, a more confined and in some ways more challenging environment than the open ocean, shallow in many areas, acoustically complicated, with relatively limited room to maneuver at the operational level. On the 10th of November, the aircraft delivery phase of Operation Perpetual was completed. 37 Hurricanes launched from Ark Royal's deck, and from Argus, guided by Blenheim aircraft from Gibraltar, flew the final leg to Malta. The delivery was a success. 34 of the 37 aircraft arrived safely, a good result by the standards of these operations, where aircraft losses to navigational error, mechanical failure, and weather were an accepted cost of the enterprise. Malta's fighter strength had been meaningfully reinforced. Force H turned westward, back toward Gibraltar. The operational objective had been achieved, and the withdrawal phase, the arguably less dramatic but equally necessary part of any operation, was underway. It was on the 13th of November, 1941, as Force H was making its way back toward Gibraltar, that the geometry of the war caught up with HMS Ark Royal. The German submarine U-81, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Guggenberger, had been operating in the area and had gained a position from which it could attack the returning force. Guggenberger had identified Ark Royal through his periscope and had closed to firing range with the patience and professional care that characterize successful submarine commanders. At approximately 15:30 hours on the 13th of November, U-81 fired a spread of 3 torpedoes at Ark Royal. One of them struck the carrier on her starboard side, forward of the island's superstructure, at a point roughly between the forward boiler rooms and the forward lift machinery spaces. The explosion was substantial, but to those aboard who survived it, not immediately catastrophic in the way a ship-killing strike might have seemed. Ark Royal shuddered, absorbed the blow, and continued on a roughly even keel for several minutes. The initial damage assessment was not encouraging. Flooding had begun immediately in multiple compartments, but the situation did not appear at first examination to be beyond the capability of her damage control teams to manage. Flooding was being reported, fires had broken out in some areas, and the electricity supply to portions of the ship had been disrupted. But Ark Royal was not listing badly in those first moments, and she still had way on. The commanding officer, Captain Loban Maund, ordered counterflooding to be initiated and began the assessment of what could be done to save the ship. What followed over the next several hours was a damage control struggle of extraordinary intensity, conducted by men who were doing everything their training and their knowledge of the ship told them to do, against a flooding situation that was, in ways that would only become fully understood later, working against them from the beginning. The single torpedo hit had disrupted the ship's electrical power distribution in ways that limited the operation of pumps. The internal layout of the flooded spaces, those engine rooms and boiler rooms that the engineering staff had privately worried about, created a flooding dynamic that drove water in directions that were difficult to counter. Without functioning pumps drawing on reliable power, the list to starboard began to develop and then to increase. Counter-flooding measures were applied and temporarily slowed the increase, but could not halt it. The destroyer HMS Legion came alongside to provide power and to assist with the towing effort that was now the primary strategy for getting Ark Royal to Gibraltar. Gibraltar was visible from the position where Ark Royal had been hit. The rock itself was on the horizon, roughly 40 kilometers away, so near. The tow began, painfully slowly, with Legion providing both assistance and a connection to the shore that felt, in the moment, like a lifeline. For a period during the late afternoon and early evening of the 13th of November, the situation seemed to stabilize. The list was not increasing as rapidly. Power was being partially restored. The flooding, though extensive, appeared to be slowing. There was a period during which the men working to save Ark Royal, and they were fighting for her with everything they had allowed themselves a measure of cautious hope. It was not an unreasonable hope. Ships had survived single torpedo hits before. Ships had been brought into port in worse condition than this appeared to be. But the flooding had not stopped. Beneath the hope, the mathematics of the situation were moving in one direction only. The pumps that were working were not keeping up with the ingress of water. The electrical systems, partially restored, were not providing sufficient power to bring the full pump capacity to bear. The list was creeping upward again slowly, but persistently, and the rate of increase was accelerating as the weight of water shifted the ship's center of gravity further from recovery. By the early hours of the 14th of November, the list had reached a point at which the decision to abandon ship could no longer be deferred. Captain Maund gave the order. The ship's company began to leave. The list had reached approximately 27 degrees to starboard when the final men left Ark Royal. At approximately 6:10 hours on the 14th of November, 1941, she rolled over onto her starboard side and sank, bow first, into roughly 900 meters of water east of Gibraltar. Of her complement, 1 man was killed in the original torpedo strike. 26 men were lost in the subsequent operations to save her. 1,587 men survived. The numbers, in the grim mathematics of wartime losses, were almost miraculously favorable had she gone down faster, had the weather been worse, had the destroyers been further away. The count would have been very different. In London, the Admiralty received the news with the particular quietness that attends genuinely large losses. HMS Ark Royal was gone. Not gone in battle, not in a gun engagement, not in the dramatic confrontation that her reputation might have seemed to demand, but torpedoed by a single submarine and lost in the slow, agonizing hours of a damage control failure. She had taken more than a day to die, and she had gone down in sight of the rock that she had called home for the previous 16 months. The Germans, who had announced her sinking so many times falsely, were finally, on this occasion, telling the truth. Chapter 9. The Inquiry. What went wrong and why it mattered. When a warship is lost, the Navy asks why. Not simply as an exercise in assigning blame, though that question is never entirely absent, but because the answer, honestly pursued, will save lives in the ships that come after. The Board of Inquiry, convened to investigate the loss of HMS Ark Royal, was a formal proceeding of the kind the Royal Navy had long tradition of conducting after disasters, and it was thorough. The National Archives holds the relevant records under ADM 1/12,157, and the conclusions reached by that inquiry have shaped naval damage control thinking ever since. The questions the board had to answer were uncomfortable ones, because the answers implicated not just the decisions made in the hours after the torpedo strike, but the design decisions made years earlier, the modification decisions not made during the operational period, and the command decisions made in the immediate aftermath of the hit. The central finding, stated plainly, was this: HMS Ark Royal should not have been lost. One torpedo hit to a ship of her size and the quality of her construction should not, in principle, have been sufficient to sink her. Ships had survived worse and made port. What converted a serious but survivable hit into a fatal one was a combination of factors, each of which was individually manageable, but which together created a situation that overwhelmed the damage control effort. The board identified the loss of electrical power as the primary cascade problem. When the torpedo struck and disrupted the forward electrical distribution network, it took offline the pumps that were most critical for controlling the flooding in the forward machinery spaces. Without those pumps running at full capacity, the water entering through the torpedo hole and through the structural damage it caused had nowhere to go except further into the ship. The secondary problem was the ship's flooding characteristics, that question of internal compartmentalization that her engineering staff had worried about for years. The way Ark Royal's internal spaces were arranged meant that flooding in the forward machinery area created a list dynamic that was self-reinforcing rather than self-limiting. Water entering on the starboard side created a list to starboard. The list to starboard caused water that had been contained in certain compartments to spill into adjacent compartments through design features, bulkhead arrangements, vent openings, access hatches that would have been fine in a static ship but were not fine in a listing one. Each degree of list made the next degree of list slightly easier to achieve. The counterflooding measures available to the damage control teams could interrupt this dynamic, but not reverse it, particularly with their pump capacity impaired. The inquiry also examined the question of the oil-fuel layout. Ark Royal carried large quantities of fuel oil in tanks that, under normal operating conditions, provided a degree of passive defense against flooding. A full fuel tank is effectively a barrier to further flooding through that space. But the tanks in the relevant areas of the ship were not full at the time of the torpedo hit. Force H had been at sea for several days, consuming fuel, and the forward tanks in the damaged area contained a mixture of oil and the airspace left by consumed fuel. The airspace reduced the passive flood resistance of those tanks and allowed water to penetrate further and faster than would have been the case if the tanks had been kept topped up. This was a lesson that subsequent Royal Navy operating procedures incorporated directly the practice of keeping fuel tanks as full as practicable during operations in threat areas, specifically to maintain their passive damage resistance. There was, additionally, the question of the ship's complement reduction in the period before the hit. The records showed that at the time of the torpedo strike, a number of men who would normally have been at their damage control stations had been stood down from full action readiness in the reasonable expectation, during the withdrawal phase of the operation, that the most dangerous period had passed. The result was that the initial damage control response, in the critical first minutes after the hit, was marginally slower to reach full strength than it would have been in full action station conditions. Minutes matter in damage control. The difference between a flood being contained and a flood getting ahead of the response can be measured in the time it takes for a trained team to reach a station and begin operating its equipment. The board noted this not as a finding of culpability, but as an operational lesson about the appropriate maintenance of damage control readiness during withdrawal from operations in submarine-threatened waters. The inquiry's findings were not widely published at the time. The war was ongoing. The propaganda implications of announcing that a single torpedo had sunk the Royal Navy's most famous carrier were obvious, and the Admiralty had no interest in helping enemy submarine commanders understand which aspects of British carriers were most vulnerable. But the lessons were circulated internally, and they were applied. HMS Illustrious, HMS Victorious, and the other fleet carriers that continued operating after Ark Royal's loss were scrutinised against the inquiry's findings, and modifications were made where they could be. The detailed review of electrical distribution resilience in British carriers specifically, the ability to maintain critical pump capacity after damage to the primary distribution network, became a standard element of damage control planning that has persisted in naval architecture ever since. Captain Loban Maund, Ark Royal's commanding officer, was court-martialed following the inquiry. The charge was essentially that he had given the order to abandon ship prematurely, that there remained, at the point at which evacuation was ordered, a realistic possibility of saving the vessel that had not been fully exhausted. The court-martial reached a verdict of censure, but not dismissal from service. The finding has remained controversial among naval historians ever since. The argument for Maund is straightforward. He was on the ship, he saw the list accelerating, he had professional responsibility for the lives of his crew, and he made a judgment call that saved more than 1,500 lives. The argument against him is that the Royal Navy had historically expected its captains to exhaust every possible measure before conceding a ship, and that additional measures remained available. Both arguments have force, and the verdict of history has generally been more sympathetic to Maund than the court-martial was. He had, after all, brought almost everyone home. One of the most instructive details in the entire inquiry was the revelation that a civilian tugboat had reached Ark Royal and could have assisted with the towing effort at a critical moment, but by the time it arrived, the ship's condition had deteriorated beyond what the additional tug could have remedied. The margin by which Gibraltar was not reached, the margin by which the ship was not saved, was genuinely narrow. This is not a comfortable fact. It is the kind of fact that keeps damage control officers awake at night, the kind of fact that makes every engineering precaution and every procedure feel essential rather than optional. The narrow margins of naval damage control are the spaces in which lives are saved or lost, ships survive or sink, and history turns one way rather than another. Vice Admiral Somerville, whose Force H had been Ark Royal's operational home for more than a year, was reported by those who knew him to have been profoundly affected by the loss. He had commanded the ship through her most consequential operations. He had been on his own flagship when the torpedo hit was reported. He had watched the damage control battle unfold over the hours that followed and had understood, before the final order was given, what the outcome was likely to be. He sent a message to the ship's company that those who received it remembered for the rest of their lives. The details of its precise wording are imperfectly preserved. The sentiment it conveyed was not. The inquiry closed. The lessons were filed, circulated, and applied. The war continued, as wars do, without pausing to mourn any single ship. But in offices at the Admiralty, and in the design departments of British shipyards, and in the damage control manuals being written for future generations of sailors, the name Ark Royal was now attached to a specific and detailed set of lessons about what not to do. She had fought brilliantly and died instructively, and both of those things have value in the long ledger of naval history. She was, even in her loss, still teaching. Chapter 10. The Legacy in the Water. What she left behind in 1941. A ship that sinks does not simply disappear. It leaves behind the men who sailed it alive, carrying memories and habits and particular pieces of knowledge that go with them into the ships they serve on next, the dockyards they work in, the families they return to, the stories they tell for the rest of their lives. It leaves behind the lessons encoded in inquiry documents and design reviews and operational procedure revisions. It leaves behind the name, freed from the wreck, available to be taken up again by whatever vessel the Navy chooses to honor it with next. And it leaves behind the intangible thing, the reputation, the accumulated weight of what the ship did and what it stood for, which does not sink when the hull does, but continues to shape the way people think about sea power and British naval history for decades and eventually for generations. HMS Ark Royal, as she sank in those early morning hours of the 14th of November, 1941, he was leaving behind a Royal Navy that was in many respects a different institution from the one that had commissioned her in December of 1938. The war had taught the Navy things about carrier aviation that no peacetime exercise could have provided. It had taught them about the vulnerability of carriers to torpedo attack, not just the abstract vulnerability predicted by pre-war analysis, but the specific, operational vulnerability that emerges from the interaction of damage, flooding, electrical failure, and the human response to crisis in real conditions at sea. It had taught them about the value of fighters operating from carriers in fleet defense, the ability to get aircraft into the air quickly, in bad weather, over extended periods, was a capability that Ark Royal had demonstrated repeatedly, and that the Navy understood far better in November of 1941 than it had in September of 1939. And it had taught them about the endurance that sustained carrier operations demanded of the men who flew the aircraft and maintained them and ran the ship. The aircrew who had served aboard Ark Royal during her operational life scattered across the Royal Naval Air Service after her loss, carrying their experience into every subsequent posting. The pilots who had flown the Swordfish strike against Bismarck men who had launched from a pitching deck in a North Atlantic storm in darkness, in aircraft that were already anachronistic by the standards of the rest of the war's aviation and had found a battleship and crippled her, were not simply doing their jobs. They were demonstrating what naval aviation could achieve in conditions that its critics had said would make it impossible. That demonstration mattered. It mattered in the debates about the future shape of the Royal Navy's carrier force. It mattered to the pilots themselves, who knew what they had done and knew that it was real rather than theoretical. It mattered to the Germans, who had sent Bismarck to sea in the absolute confidence that a modern battleship was beyond the reach of antiquated biplanes, and had been comprehensively disabused of that confidence in a single evening. The Swordfish aircraft itself deserves a moment of attention in any account of what Ark Royal left behind. The fairy Swordfish had entered service in 1936, and it was, by the standards of 1941, a genuinely old-fashioned aircraft. It was a biplane, fabric-covered, with fixed undercarriage, cruising at roughly 90 miles per hour and reaching a maximum of perhaps 140. Modern naval aircraft in other countries' inventories were twice as fast, enclosed in metal skin, and considered the Swordfish an interesting museum piece. But the Swordfish had qualities that its more modern competitors lacked. It could operate in weather conditions that grounded faster aircraft. It was forgiving of the kind of rough handling that carrier landings in bad sea states inevitably produced, and its low speed, counterintuitively, made it harder to intercept with some types of anti-aircraft fire, which were calibrated for faster targets. Ark Royal's experience had shown that the aircraft, in the hands of trained crews, could deliver meaningful strikes against the most powerful surface ships afloat. The Swordfish went on to serve throughout the war and to sink more Axis shipping tonnage than any other Allied torpedo aircraft. The lesson Ark Royal encoded in naval thinking was that technology is only one factor in combat effectiveness, and not always the most important one. The men who came ashore from Ark Royal in November of 1941, those more than 1,500 survivors who disembarked at Gibraltar, carrying whatever personal possessions they had managed to bring off, had a story that the British public was hungry to hear. The Navy was careful about what it released and when, for the obvious reasons of operational security, but the broad outline of what had happened could not be kept from a public that had been following HMS Ark Royal's career in the form available to wartime newspaper readers since the beginning of the war. This was the ship that had been declared dead half a dozen times by German radio. This was the ship whose pilots had stopped the Bismarck. Now she was actually gone, and the country had to absorb that fact. The reaction, filtered through the wartime information environment, was one of genuine national mourning combined with a determined emphasis on the survival of her crew as evidence that the spirit the ship represented had not been lost with the hull. For the German Navy, the sinking of Ark Royal was a genuine strategic and propaganda achievement, and they treated it as such. Guggenberger and the crew of U-81 were celebrated. Guggenberger received the Knight's Cross, and the German propaganda machinery, which had been making premature claims about Ark Royal's destruction for 2 years, finally had an actual destruction to point to. From a purely naval perspective, the removal of Ark Royal from the order of battle was a significant blow. She had been the most experienced, most operationally capable fleet carrier in the Royal Navy's inventory, and her loss at the precise moment when the war in the Mediterranean was entering one of its most demanding phases was a cost that could not simply be absorbed without consequence. HMS Eagle was still operational in the Mediterranean, and HMS Victorious and HMS Formidable were available in other theatres, but none of them combined Ark Royal's experience, her aircrew proficiency, and her institutional knowledge of Mediterranean operations in the same way. The wreck of HMS Ark Royal lay undisturbed on the Mediterranean floor for nearly 6 decades after her sinking. In December of 2002, a search conducted by Channel 4 television using the survey vessel Octopus located the wreck at a depth of roughly 1,015 meters, approximately 50 kilometers west of Gibraltar, somewhat further west than contemporary estimates had placed her. The wreck was found lying on its starboard side, which was consistent with the list direction observed in the hours before her sinking. The bow had separated from the main hull during the sinking. The flight deck, where the swordfish biplanes that stopped the Bismarck had been ranged and launched, lay at the bottom of the sea, in darkness, in water cold enough to preserve much of the wreck's structure remarkably well. The images returned by the survey cameras showed a ship that still looked like a ship, recognizable, identifiable, a physical connection to events that had by then passed from living memory to history. The reaction to the discovery of the wreck was widespread and genuinely moved. There were men still alive in 2002 who had served aboard HMS Ark Royal. They were old men by then, in their 80s and 90s, and they watched the footage of their ship on the seabed with an emotional complexity that no single word adequately captures. For them, the wreck was not an abstraction. It was a place where they had lived, worked, eaten, slept, been frightened, been proud, lost colleagues, survived impossibilities. The steel corridors visible in the survey footage were corridors they had walked. The spaces now filled with seawater were spaces where they had repaired aircraft and run damage control drills and told jokes and quarreled and done all the ordinary things that men do when they live together at close quarters for a long time under extreme stress. History, in the end, is built from these two things: the record of what happened and the memory of what it felt like to be there. The wreck of HMS Ark Royal holds both. The record is in the inquiry documents and the operational logs and the engineering reports. The memory was in the men who came ashore at Gibraltar with whatever they could carry and who carried the rest of it inside them for the rest of their lives. Neither the record nor the memory sank with the ship. They survived, as she would have wanted. Chapter 11. The name lives on. The Fourth Ark Royal and the Jet Age. Britain does not retire a name lightly, particularly not a name like Ark Royal. There had been, even before the third carrier was fully lost, the understanding that another ship would eventually carry the name, that the lineage which ran from an Elizabethan galleon through a First World War seaplane tender to the carrier that stopped the Bismarck was a lineage too important to allow to lapse. The question was not whether there would be another Ark Royal, but what she would be and when. The answer came in the form of one of the most consequential carriers in Royal Navy history, a ship that carried the name from 1955 to 1979 and did so during a period that was, in its own way, as challenging and transformative for British naval aviation as the Second World War had been. The fourth HMS Ark Royal was laid down at Camel Laird, the same yard that had built her predecessor, with her keel laid in May of 1943, while the war was still in progress and the ink on the inquiry into the third Ark Royal's loss was barely dry. She was launched in May of 1950, but completion was repeatedly delayed as the Royal Navy grappled with the financial and strategic uncertainties of the immediate post-war period, and as the technology of carrier aviation underwent changes so rapid that the designs being built were in danger of being obsolete before they were finished. The jet aircraft had arrived during the war and was transforming every aspect of carrier operations. Jet aircraft were faster, heavier, and more demanding in their approach and landing characteristics than the piston aircraft for which existing carriers had been designed. A jet aircraft approaching at 150 or 160 knots, trying to land on a deck designed for aircraft touching down at 90, represented a fundamentally different engineering problem. The Fourth Ark Royal was commissioned on the 25th of February, 1955, as the first Royal Navy carrier specifically completed with the new features that made jet operations practical and safe. These features had been developed through the late 1940s and early 1950s by British naval aviation engineers, and they represented genuine innovations that transformed carrier aviation not just for Britain but for every navy in the world that operated carriers. The most significant was the angled flight deck, a concept developed by Royal Navy Captain Dennis Campbell and subsequently adopted by the Americans, the French, the Indians, and eventually virtually every carrier operating navy on Earth. The angled deck allowed aircraft to land on a portion of the flight deck set at an angle to the ship's centerline, meaning that an aircraft that missed the arresting wires could apply full power and fly off the angled section without striking aircraft parked forward. This eliminated the net barriers that had previously been the only protection against a landing aircraft running into the forward deck park, and it transformed the safety and efficiency of carrier landing operations overnight. The Fourth Ark Royal also incorporated the steam catapult, another British invention of the same period, which replaced the older hydraulic catapults with a system capable of launching the heavier and faster jet aircraft at the acceleration rates their performance envelopes required. And she incorporated the mirror landing sight, a third British innovation, which gave pilots an optical reference for their approach path that was far more precise and responsive than the hand signals of batsmen that had been the standard method of guiding aircraft onto the deck in the Second World War. Period. These three innovations, the angled deck, the steam catapult, and the mirror sight, formed a package that defined the modern carrier, and that the Fourth Ark Royal carried into service as their first full demonstration platform in the Royal Navy. She was a large ship commissioned at roughly 46,000 tons full load. She was eventually modified during her service life to handle the largest aircraft in the Royal Navy's inventory. Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, she operated successive generations of carrier aircraft: the de Havilland Sea Venom, the de Havilland Sea Vixen, the Buccaneer strike aircraft, and eventually the McDonnell Douglas Phantom, the American-built but British-modified supersonic interceptor that was the most capable aircraft ever to operate from a Royal Navy carrier during the conventional era. These were not biplanes. The Phantom was a twin-engined supersonic aircraft carrying radar and missiles and capable of intercepting targets at altitudes and speeds that the swordfish pilots of the previous Ark Royal would have found barely comprehensible. That both aircraft wore the same roundel and flew from a ship bearing the same name was a measure of how completely the previous 3 decades had transformed the technology of naval aviation. The Fourth Ark Royal service life was not defined by a single dramatic episode in the way the third carriers had been. She served during the Cold War, when the nature of British naval operations was shaped by the confrontation with Soviet sea power rather than the visible, documented engagements of the Second World War. Her operations in the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the waters around the British Isles were largely conducted in a framework of deterrence and presence rather than actual combat. She participated in exercises and deployments across a wide geographic range, and her significance was as much political and symbolic as it was purely operational. Britain's ability to project naval air power depended, during this period, on ships like Ark Royal, and the argument about whether that ability was worth its cost was a constant presence in defence debates throughout her service. The 1970s were a difficult decade for the Royal Navy's carrier force. Britain's defence budget was under sustained pressure, and the case for large conventional carriers was being challenged by those who argued that the cost of operating them was disproportionate to the strategic benefit they delivered in a nuclear era defined by superpower confrontation. The announcement in the Defence Review of 1966 that Britain would withdraw from east of Suez, which had been one of the primary strategic justifications for the large carrier force, was a significant blow to the arguments supporting carriers. The Fourth Ark Royal survived that review, but the writing was becoming clearer on successive white papers. Her retirement was announced, and she conducted her final operational deployment in 1978, paying off in December of 1978. She was scrapped in 1980, broken up at Cairnryan in Scotland. The final operational flight from her deck is remembered with particular emotion by those who were there. A Buccaneer aircraft made the last arrested landing as the ship prepared to return home for the last time, and the moment was photographed, filmed, and preserved as a kind of visual elegy for an era. There is something arresting, and the word carries its literal naval meaning here, about the last aircraft catching the last wire on the last operational day of a ship named for a vessel that had sailed against the Armada 400 years before. The chain of continuity in that moment is long enough to make the distance between a Elizabethan galleon and a Buccaneer strike aircraft seem almost irrelevant. The name would return, in a different form, on a different kind of ship. But before it did, the Royal Navy would go through a crisis that would reshape its entire relationship with carrier aviation, a small war in the South Atlantic that demonstrated, at very high cost, exactly what happens when the capability that carriers provide is absent at the moment it is most needed. That war was the Falklands, and it was coming. Chapter 12, After Ark Royal, the Falklands Gap and the Lessons of Absence. The most powerful argument for a capability is sometimes not what it achieves when it is present, but what its absence costs. In the spring of 1982, Argentina seized the Falkland Islands, a British overseas territory in the South Atlantic, approximately 12,000 kilometers from the United Kingdom. The seizure was sudden, the Argentinian garrison quickly overwhelming the small Royal Marine detachment that offered the only immediate resistance. In London, the response was both immediate and constrained by a brutal strategic reality. Britain was going to have to retake those islands from 8,000 miles away, with no local bases, no air cover from land-based fighters, and a force that would have to operate in the South Atlantic winter, carrying everything it needed with it from the moment it left home waters. It was, by any calm military assessment, an extraordinarily demanding operational problem. What made it solvable narrowly, at significant cost, was carrier aviation. The task force that sailed south included two carriers, HMS Hermes, a conventionally built carrier dating from 1959, and HMS Invincible, the first of a new class of light carriers that had entered service in 1980 and represented the Royal Navy's compromised, budget-constrained answer to the question of how to maintain carrier aviation when full-sized conventional carriers were no longer affordable. Both ships operated the Hawker Siddeley Sea Harrier, a vertical and short takeoff and landing combat aircraft that could operate from the relatively small decks of these ships without the steam catapults and arresting gear that conventional carriers required. The Sea Harrier was not the supersonic, radar-equipped Phantom that the Fourth Ark Royal had operated. It was smaller, less capable in some respects, but it was there, it was working, and in the particular tactical environment of the Falklands conflict, it proved sufficient to the task. The defence reviews that had driven the Fourth Ark Royal to the breaker's yard had also cancelled the programme for her planned successor, a large conventional carrier that would have maintained the Royal Navy's ability to operate the full range of high-performance aircraft. The argument made in those reviews was that Britain no longer required the capability to project carrier air power at long range without shore-based support, because the primary focus of British defence planning was the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation's European theatre, where land-based aircraft could provide the necessary cover. The Falklands made that argument look precisely as vulnerable as its critics had always said it was. Wars do not always happen in the theatre you have planned for. The South Atlantic in 1982 was not in anyone's NATO planning document, and yet there was HMS Hermes, 23 years old, carrying the task force's air defense on a deck that was too small for the job but was the only deck available. The Falklands campaign is not, strictly, part of HMS Ark Royal's history. There was no Ark Royal in the South Atlantic in 1982, but it is part of the context in which the next ship to bear the name was conceived and justified. The lessons of the Falklands that Britain needed more carrier capacity, that the existing light carriers were stretched dangerously thin, that the absence of a larger vessel with greater aircraft capacity had been felt acutely throughout the campaign, fed directly into the arguments that eventually produced the programme for the 5th Ark Royal, which would be the third of the Invincible-class light carriers. She was a ship conceived in the shadow of an absence, built to fill a gap that the Falklands had made visible in the most direct way possible. The case for her was not made in planning documents or strategic reviews. It was made on the flight decks of Hermes and Invincible as they operated at maximum capacity, day and night, in South Atlantic, weather that was as unforgiving as anything the 3rd Ark Royal had faced in the Mediterranean. The Falklands also revived a debate about the name itself, about what the name Ark Royal meant, what it stood for, and whether it should be attached to a light carrier that was, in terms of raw capability, a considerably more modest vessel than the ships that had previously carried it. The 4th Ark Royal had been the last of the great conventional fleet carriers. The ships that came after were smaller, less capable of operating the most demanding aircraft, limited in a way that the fleet carrier had not been. There were those in the Navy and in the enthusiast community who felt that attaching the name Ark Royal to an Invincible-class light carrier was a category error, that the name carried an expectation of scale and capability that the smaller ship could not reasonably inherit. Others argued, with equal conviction, that a name's meaning comes from what the ship does with it, not from the dimensions of the hull it is attached to, and that the Invincible-class carriers had earned their place in the lineage by doing what was asked of them in circumstances that were as demanding as anything the earlier ships had faced. The social and institutional dimensions of the Falklands experience left marks on the Royal Navy that were as deep, in their own way, as the operational ones. The campaign had demonstrated, at the cost of several ships and hundreds of lives, the specific shape of the risks that attended naval operations in an era of sea-skimming, anti-ship missiles and sophisticated air threats. The ships lost in the Falklands, HMS Sheffield, HMS Coventry, HMS Atlantic Conveyor, HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope were lost in ways that the naval architects and damage control planners of the 1950s and 60s had not fully anticipated. The Exocet missile that struck HMS Sheffield demonstrated the lethality of modern sea-skimming anti-ship weapons in terms that no training exercise had prepared the Navy's damage control teams for. The lessons that the sinking of the 3rd Ark Royal had encoded in 1941 about electrical damage, pump capacity, and flooding response were revisited and updated in the light of what the Falklands had added to the knowledge base. The debate about the future of British carrier aviation that followed the Falklands was not, in the end, resolved cleanly or quickly. It ran through the 1980s and into the 90s and eventually produced the Strategic Defence Review of 1998, which recommended the development of 2 new large carriers vessels that would be, in terms of size and capability, closer to the 4th Ark Royal than to the Invincible class. The carriers that eventually emerged from that programme, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, were in their early operational service as the 21st century moved through its second decade. They were the largest warships ever built for the Royal Navy, and their commissioning closed a circle that had been opened when the Admiralty decided, in the 1960s and 70s, that Britain could not afford large conventional carriers. The Falklands had opened that circle's second half. The Queen Elizabeth class closed it. None of this was inevitable. History does not move by necessity, and the Royal Navy's carrier capability could easily have been further reduced or eliminated entirely in any of the defence reviews between 1966 and the present. That it was not that the capability was maintained, even at reduced scale, through the Invincible class years, and then rebuilt through the Queen Elizabeth program, reflects a series of decisions, arguments, and political accidents that played out over decades. The name Ark Royal runs through all of it like a thread. It is the name that appears in arguments about what British sea power should look like, invoked by those who believe Britain needs the capability the name represents and countered by those who believe the costs outweigh the benefits. The name carries its history into every debate it enters, and its history is, as this account has tried to show, substantial. What began in 1587 with a wooden galleon and an unpaid debt has never really stopped. It has changed shape, changed technology, moved from sail to steam to jets and beyond. But the argument it embodies about whether Britain will maintain the ability to project power from the sea, in places where no shore base exists, in conditions that make every alternative impossible, is the same argument at its core. HMS Ark Royal, in all her incarnations, has been the physical expression of one side of that argument. And the argument, as of the moment we are telling this story, is still very much in progress. The sea is patient. It has waited for every Ark Royal that ever sailed. It will wait for the ones that come after too. We are halfway through this story, and you are still here. That means something. If you are watching this in the dark, with the volume low, just letting history wash over you good. That is exactly what this is for. The next 6 chapters take us deep into the Cold War years, the Invincible era, and the extraordinary journey toward the carriers that sail today. Stay with us. Subscribe if you have not, and we will see you in the next chapter. Chapter 13, The Fifth Ark, Royal, born from compromise, built for war. There is a particular kind of ship that exists not because anyone wanted exactly what was built, but because the collision between what was needed and what could be afforded produced something in between, and that something, in the right hands, turned out to be enough. The 5th HMS Ark Royal, the 3rd of the Royal Navy's Invincible class of light carriers, was that kind of ship. She was not born from a clean, strategic vision of what British sea power should look like. She was born from the wreckage of arguments that had been running through the defence establishment since the late 1960s. Arguments about cost, about strategic relevance, about the relationship between carrier aviation and the nuclear deterrent, about whether a medium-sized island nation with a shrinking empire and a pressured treasury could justify the expense of maintaining a genuine fleet carrier capability at all. The answer that emerged from those arguments, filtered through the Falklands experience and the subsequent reappraisal of naval requirements, was the Invincible class. And the 5th Ark Royal was the last and, in many respects, the most capable ship of that class. She was laid down at Swan Hunter's Yard on the River Tyne in December of 1978, the same month the 4th Ark Royal paid off and was launched on the 2nd of June, 1981, by Queen Elizabeth II. Her commissioning followed on the 1st of November, 1985, 4 years after launch, a delay that reflected the usual combination of budget pressure, design refinement, and the measured pace of naval construction in a period when the defence budget was not expanding. She entered service as HMS Ark Royal RO7, her pennant number marking her as the 7th Royal Navy vessel to carry the name, though the formal count of Ark Royals is a matter of some historiographical debate depending on how certain earlier vessels are classified. She displaced roughly 20,000 tons at standard load, less than half the displacement of the 4th Ark Royal, and she was roughly 210 metres in length. A carrier by function if not by the scale standards of earlier generations. Her air group, when she commissioned, consisted of Sea Harrier aircraft for fixed-wing operations and Sea King helicopters for anti-submarine and airborne early warning roles. The combination was not what a carrier planner of 1950 would have considered adequate for a fleet carrier. There were no conventional high-performance supersonic aircraft, no steam catapults, no arresting gear wires in the traditional sense. The ski jump ramp fitted to her bow, a feature that had been developed and proven by the earlier Invincible-class ships during the Falklands campaign, allowed the Sea Harrier to launch with a heavier load than a flat deck would have permitted, angling the aircraft upward at roughly 12 degrees at the moment of takeoff, and giving the jet's thrust a vertical component that extended range and payload. It was an elegant engineering solution to the constraint of operating fixed-wing aircraft from a smaller deck. And it worked, but it was unmistakably a compromise, and the Royal Navy knew it. What the Fifth Ark Royal brought to the fleet was not simply additional hulls. She brought institutional experience and continuity at a moment when the Navy's carrier aviation capability had been stretched dangerously thin by the simultaneous Falklands deployments of Hermes and Invincible. With 3 Invincible-class ships operational, Invincible, Illustrious, and Ark Royal, the Royal Navy could maintain a more sustainable rotation of 1 carrier in refit, 1 working up, and 1 operational, which was the minimum needed to provide a continuous deployed presence without running each ship into the ground. The lessons of the Third Ark Royal's wartime service, that continuous high-tempo operations without adequate maintenance and rest periods degrade both machinery and men, had been encoded into the Navy's force. Planning. 3 hulls were the minimum for the rotation to work. Ark Royal's commissioning completed that minimum. Her early service years were defined by the rhythms of Cold War naval operations in the North Atlantic. The principal threat scenario for which the Royal Navy was planning in the mid-1980s was a Soviet submarine offensive against the transatlantic supply lines, on which any conventional defense of Western Europe would depend. NATO strategy required the ability to keep those supply lines open in the face of Soviet submarine attack, and the Royal Navy's contribution to that effort centered on anti-submarine operations in the Norwegian Sea and North Atlantic specifically, the effort to detect, track, and if necessary engage Soviet submarines before they could reach the open Atlantic shipping lanes. HMS Ark Royal's air group, with its complement of anti-submarine Sea Kings, was a meaningful contribution to this effort, and her exercises and deployments through the late 1980s were oriented primarily around this threat. The Cold War context gave the Fifth Ark Royal's service a quality quite different from either the Third Carrier's wartime operations or the Fourth Carrier's combination of Cold War deterrence and residual imperial policing. Commitments. The threats she trained against were real, assessed seriously by naval intelligence, and capable in theory of posing a genuine strategic danger, but they never materialized in the form of actual combat. The Soviet submarines she tracked in exercises were shadows on sonar screens, professional adversaries in a game that both sides played with deadly seriousness, and that, perhaps through skill and perhaps through fortune and perhaps through the simple rationality of mutual deterrence, never escalated into the thing it was preparing for. This gave the Fifth Ark Royal's Cold War service a quality that is genuinely difficult to narrate, the quality of readiness exercised at very high cost, in the service of a crisis that was perpetually imminent and perpetually avoided. The 1990s changed everything. The Soviet Union dissolved between 1990 and 1991, and with its dissolution, the strategic framework that had defined British defence planning for 4 decades evaporated. The Warsaw Pact was gone. The threat of a Soviet breakthrough in Central Europe was gone. The requirement for anti-submarine operations at the scale of the Cold War's peak was gone, at least in its original form. What replaced it was a series of regional conflicts and humanitarian crises that demanded a different kind of military capability, flexible, deployable, able to project power into areas where no prior planning and no permanent basing had been established. This was, as it turned out, exactly the kind of capability that carrier aviation provides. Ark Royal's post-Cold War service took her into operational scenarios that her designers had not specifically anticipated. The crisis in the former Yugoslavia, the tensions in the Gulf following the First Gulf War, the interventions in Sierra Leone, these were not scenarios from the NATO exercise catalogue. They required the Royal Navy to demonstrate that its carrier capability was relevant to a new strategic environment, and HMS Ark Royal was one of the platforms through which that demonstration was made. She proved adaptable in ways that justified the investment in maintaining the carrier capability through the financially difficult post-Cold War years, when the temptation to cash what was called the peace dividend by eliminating expensive naval capabilities was considerable. Each deployment that demonstrated her operational value was, in a small way, an argument against the next round of defense review cuts. By the time the Fifth Ark Royal reached the middle of her expected service life, the debate about the future of British carrier aviation had shifted from whether Britain should maintain carriers at all to what kind of carriers Britain should build next. The Strategic Defence Review of 1998 had resolved, at least in principle, the question of whether large conventional carriers should return to the fleet. The answer was yes. What remained was the long, complicated, expensive, and repeatedly delayed process of actually building them. The Fifth Ark Royal would sail on through that process, performing her operations and her exercises and her deployments, growing older, requiring more maintenance with each passing year, waiting for the ships that would eventually replace her and release the name for its next incarnation. She was, in those later years, still unmistakably HMS Ark Royal. The pennant number, the ensign, the name painted on the hull, these connected her to every ship that had carried the name before, including the one that had stopped the Bismarck 6 decades earlier. The men aboard her knew the weight of that connection. Naval tradition is not merely ceremonial. It is a practical tool for transmitting professional standards and institutional values across generations of sailors who never met each other. When a young rating aboard the Fifth Ark Royal learned the ship's history, he was not receiving a museum lecture. He was being told what was expected of him, what the name on the hull demanded, what the standard was. 400 years of Ark Royal. That is a great deal of standard to live up to. By all available accounts, they tried. Chapter 14. Cold War Shadows, Operations, Exercises, and the Art of Deterrence. The great paradox of Cold War naval service is that its success is invisible. If deterrence works, if the patrols and the exercises and the intelligence gathering and the maintained readiness prevent the catastrophe they are designed to prevent, then nothing happens. No battle is fought. No headline is written. No monument is built. The ships that spent the Cold War's decades tracking Soviet submarines through the North Atlantic, maintaining their readiness, demonstrating their capability, contributing their small but genuine portion to the vast collective enterprise of keeping the peace between nuclear-armed superpowers, those ships have no battle honours from those operations. They have sea miles, wear on their machinery, and the quiet satisfaction of professional work performed in the service of an outcome that history records only as the absence of the worst thing. HMS Ark Royal's service during the Cold War years was precisely this kind of invisible success. Her deployments to the North Atlantic and the Norwegian Sea were exercises in the detection and tracking of Soviet submarine activity operations conducted with the full professionalism of the Royal Navy, but in conditions that offered none of the clear narrative satisfaction of combat. A submarine tracked to a particular position and then lost, and then relocated by a Sea King helicopter dropping sonar buoys into an Arctic sea state. This is not a story that tells itself easily. The technology is opaque, the geography is featureless ocean, the adversary is invisible, and the outcome is either nothing happening or nothing happening for a slightly different reason. And yet this was the work, and it mattered enormously to the strategic balance that defined the period. The exercises through which Ark Royal and her consorts prepared for their Cold War roles were conducted on a scale that peacetime observers rarely appreciate. NATO's annual exercise program in the North Atlantic involved coordinated maneuvers of carriers, surface escorts, submarines, and maritime patrol aircraft from multiple nations, operating over millions of square miles of ocean in conditions that ranged from difficult to genuinely dangerous. The North Atlantic in winter is not a hospitable environment. Seas routinely ran to 8 or 10 meters. Winds could gust to hurricane force. Temperatures on the flight deck in January north of the Arctic Circle, where Soviet submarines would most likely try to transit between their bases on the Kola Peninsula and the open Atlantic, were cold enough to make mechanical work painful and concentrated thought difficult. The crews of Ark Royal's Sea King helicopters, conducting anti-submarine searches in these conditions, were doing genuinely demanding work in a genuinely hostile environment, even when no Soviet submarine was present. The intelligence dimension of Cold War carrier operations is one that has become somewhat clearer as the decades have passed and classification has lapsed on some of the relevant material. Carriers operating in the Norwegian Sea were not simply training platforms or deterrence symbols. They were intelligence-gathering assets, their sensors and their aircraft collecting information on Soviet naval movements, tactics, acoustic signatures, and operational patterns that fed into the continuous assessment of Soviet naval capability that the British and American intelligence communities maintained throughout the Cold War. HMS Ark Royal's operations contributed to this effort in ways that were necessarily classified at the time and have been only partially disclosed since. The full picture of what she contributed to the knowledge base of Western naval intelligence during her Cold War service is probably not yet fully public. The relationship between the 5th Ark Royal and her American counterparts in NATO exercises was a close one, and it illustrated both the strengths and the limitations of the Royal Navy's Cold War carrier capability. American supercarriers, the Nimitz class, operating from the mid-1970s onward, were in a different capability category from the Invincible class. They were larger, faster, capable of operating a far wider range of aircraft, and equipped with the full suite of catapults and arresting gear that conventional carrier aviation required. Operating alongside them in exercises, Royal Navy officers were acutely aware of the capability gap, but they were also aware of what the Invincible class could do that the supercarriers could not do, as readily operate in shallower waters, in more confined sea areas, with a smaller logistical footprint, and contribute meaningfully to the anti-submarine mission that was in many ways the most pressing naval requirement of the Cold War period. Different capabilities for different problems, and NATO's strength lay in combining them effectively. The transition from Cold War to post-Cold War operations in the early 1990s presented HMS Ark Royal with a different kind of challenge. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not reduce the Royal Navy's operational tempo, if anything. The emergence of multiple regional crises simultaneously increased the demands on a fleet that was simultaneously being reduced in size as the defense dividend was collected. The Gulf region remained tense following the First Gulf War of 1990 and 91. The Balkans descended into a series of conflicts that eventually required NATO military intervention. West Africa presented humanitarian crises that British carriers and their helicopters were uniquely well placed to address. HMS Ark Royal moved through this changed landscape with the pragmatic adaptability that the Royal Navy had always prided itself on, the ability to take a ship designed for one strategic environment and make it useful in a series of environments that looked quite different. Her participation in operations related to the Bosnian conflict was one illustration of this adaptability. Royal Navy carriers operating in the Adriatic during the mid-1990s were part of the NATO force structure that eventually contributed to the enforcement of the no-fly zone over Bosnia and the protection of UN-safe areas. The mission was vastly different from Cold War anti-submarine operations or from the Second World War convoy, escort and strike missions that had defined earlier Ark Royals. It required integration with joint headquarters, coordination with land forces and diplomatic processes, and the management of rules of engagement that were at times frustratingly complicated. The flexibility demanded of naval aviation in this environment was a different kind of flexibility from what the Cold War had required, less about physical endurance and sensor technology, more about operational and political judgment. The human dimension of service aboard the 5th Ark Royal through this period is captured imperfectly, as the human dimension of any collective experience is always imperfectly captured in the accounts of those who served. The ship's company through the 1980s and 90s was drawn from every corner of Britain, from naval families with multiple generations of service, and from young men and women for whom the Navy was a first job and an adventure rather than a calling. The democratization of Royal Navy service that had been accelerating since the Second World War had produced a fleet that looked and sounded quite different from the pre-war Navy, and that was, in most measurable respects, better for it. The technical demands of operating a modern warship required skills that took years to develop, and that the Navy invested heavily in training. The people who operated Ark Royal sensors, flew her aircraft, maintained her engines, and managed her damage control systems were, by any objective measure, as professional and capable as any generation of British sailors before them. The Fifth Ark Royal's final Cold War exercise, as such things are never quite labelled at the time, occurred in the closing months of the Soviet Union's existence in waters that would shortly thereafter be navigated by Russian ships rather than Soviet ones. The distinction matters, historically, even if the physical geography and the sea states did not change. What changed was the meaning of the patrols, the threat they were designed to deter, and the enemy they were trained to defeat simply ceased to exist in the form that had defined them. The men aboard Ark Royal, who had spent their careers preparing for the war that did not happen, lived through that historical transition in real time, and their reactions to it were as varied as their backgrounds. Some felt relief, some felt a professional deflation, the dissolution of the defined enemy who had given their training its purpose and their readiness its stakes. Most felt something more complex, something that contained both of those elements, along with the ordinary professional satisfaction of having performed their jobs well in the service of an outcome that, whatever its ambiguities, was better than the alternative. The Cold War was over. The Fifth Ark Royal was 14 years into a service life that would extend another 2 decades. The world she would operate in for the rest of her career looked different from the world she had been built for, and the demands it would make were different, and the threats it presented were different. But the sea was the same, and the name on the hull was the same, and both of those things, in the long account of what it means to be HMS Ark Royal, count for something. Chapter 15. Into the New Century. Operations from Sierra Leone to Afghanistan. Wars at the turn of a century have a particular quality of historical surprise about them. They arrive from directions that the planning assumptions of the previous era did not anticipate, in places that the maps in the Defense Review documents did not mark as critical, against adversaries whose methods fall outside the categories that military doctrine had been preparing for. The conflicts that defined the early 21st century for the British Armed Forces, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Iraq, shared this quality of arriving sideways, of demanding capabilities that existed for other reasons and had to be adapted on the run. HMS Ark Royal was part of the Royal Navy's response to this new landscape, and her service in these years demonstrated both what a carrier could do in complex modern operations and where the boundaries of that utility lay. Sierra Leone in the year 2000 was one of the clearest demonstrations of what carrier-based naval power can contribute to a humanitarian and stabilization crisis in a context where no land bases are available and where the political complexities of the region make shore-based intervention problematic. The conflict in Sierra Leone between government forces and the Revolutionary United Front had produced one of the decade's most severe humanitarian disasters, with a civilian population subjected to systematic brutality by a faction whose methods of instilling terror were among the worst recorded in post-Cold War Africa. Britain's decision to intervene, operating under the authority of a United Nations mandate in support of the Sierra Leonean government, produced Operation Palliser and HMS Illustrious, which deployed as part of the initial response, demonstrated precisely the kind of flexible, long-range power projection that carriers provide and that no other platform can replicate. The Fifth Ark Royal's involvement came in the context of the subsequent operation and the broader demonstration of capability that the Sierra Leone intervention provided. The Sierra Leone operation illustrated a principle that naval strategists had been arguing for years in the teeth of budget reviews and strategic reassessments, that the utility of a carrier is precisely greatest in the scenarios that are hardest to predict, when there is no basing arrangement, no established logistical chain, no friendly territory within range, and no time to negotiate the access that shore-based air power requires. A carrier appears off the coast, and the problem of providing air power is solved. Not every problem, and not every kind of air power, but in Sierra Leone, the combination of helicopters for troop insertion and medical evacuation, the implied presence of fixed-wing aircraft for more serious contingencies, and the command and control facilities that a large naval vessel provides, created exactly the kind of flexible military option that a government facing a rapidly deteriorating situation needs. The attacks on the United States on the 11th of September 2001 changed the strategic environment again more suddenly and more completely than any development since the end of the Cold War. Britain's response to the American declaration of a global campaign against terrorist networks included a significant naval commitment, and the 5th Ark Royal was part of that commitment. She deployed in support of operations in the period following the September attacks, operating in the Arabian Sea and contributing to the coalition effort in ways that were, necessarily, less visible than the spectacular air campaign over Afghanistan, but no less real for that. The Navy's contribution to the early phases of the Afghanistan campaign included submarine-launched cruise missile strikes, maritime patrol operations, and the carrier presence that provided a command platform and a flexible air option in waters adjacent to the operational area. The Iraq War of 2003 presented the Royal Navy with a more complex political and strategic environment than Afghanistan had. The legal and political controversy surrounding the decision to go to war in Iraq and the subsequent debate about the intelligence that had been used to justify it created a climate in which the military services were operating under a degree of public and political scrutiny that was unusual by the standards of previous deployments. HMS Ark Royal was deployed as part of the British naval contribution to the initial operations in Iraq in 2003, and her service in this period carried both the operational demands of the mission and the weight of the political context in which it was being conducted. The men and women aboard her were professional sailors doing a specific job in a specific place, and the wider political debate about the wisdom and justification of the operation was something they followed in the same way that anyone follows events that directly affect them, with attention, with opinion, and with the pragmatic acceptance that their job was to be ready and capable regardless of the political weather. The first decade of the 21st century was, in aggregate, the most operationally diverse period in the 5th Ark Royal's service. She had been built for a Cold War that ended before her service was half over, and she spent the second half of her service in a strategic environment defined by asymmetric conflict, humanitarian intervention, and the complex coalitions of the post-September 11 era. Each of these contexts made different demands. The Cold War had required sustained readiness for a specific, high-intensity threat scenario. The post-Cold War decade had required flexibility and rapid adaptation to unpredicted crises. The post-September 11 period required the integration of carrier operations with joint and combined force structures of a complexity that previous generations of naval officers had not had to manage. Through all of it, the 5th Ark Royal and her ships companies adapted. The role of women in the ship's company through this period deserves specific note. The Royal Navy had been integrating women into seagoing service since the early 1990s, and by the first decade of the 21st century, the presence of women, officers, and ratings in the ship's company was entirely normalized in the institutional sense, even if the practical accommodation of mixed service in the close-quarters environment of a warship continued to require ongoing management. The 5th Ark Royal ship's companies through this period included women in technical, medical, administrative, and increasingly operational roles that would have been entirely unfamiliar to the men who had sailed the 3rd Ark Royal 60 years before. This was not simply a social change. It was a practical expansion of the talent pool from which the Navy could draw, and it improved the institution. By the middle of the first decade of the 21st century, the question of when the 5th Ark Royal would pay off was becoming more pressing. She was approaching 20 years of service, and the combination of accumulated wear, the cost of the maintenance required to keep her operational, and the progress being made on the Queen Elizabeth-class carriers that would eventually replace the Invincible class was beginning to sharpen the calculations about her remaining service life. She was not worn out in the way that an overworked warship from an earlier era might have been. The Royal Navy's maintenance standards were high, and the ship had been well looked after, but she was approaching the phase of her life where maintenance costs increase more rapidly, and where the case for continued investment has to be measured against what comes next. The operational record she was accumulating through these years was, by any honest assessment, impressive. She had served in waters from the Arctic to the Arabian Sea. She had contributed to Cold War deterrence, post-Cold War crisis management, humanitarian intervention, and the complex coalition operations of the 21st century's first decade. She had done all of this as the third of three Invincible-class ships, never the newest or the most publicized, carrying a name that attracted historical expectation and meeting it with professional competence, if not with the dramatic single-episode battles that had made the third and fourth Ark Royals famous. Competence sustained over decades is harder to narrate than heroism concentrated in a single afternoon. But in the long ledger of naval service, it is not less valuable. One more decade of service remained, and it would end as the third Ark Royals had ended, with a torpedo, not a literal one this time, but the bureaucratic equivalent, delivered by a defence review rather than a U-boat, in a London office rather than a Mediterranean afternoon. The effect, in terms of the ship's fate, would be the same. Chapter 16, The Last Voyage. Decommissioning, and the end of an era. There is a cruelty specific to peacetime defence reviews that wartime sinkings do not share. When HMS Ark Royal, the third carrier, the one that stopped the Bismarck, was lost on the 14th of November 1941, she went down fighting, having spent every hour of her operational life in the service of the mission she was built for. Her end was premature and painful, and it left a gap that the Royal Navy felt acutely. But there was no ambiguity about what had happened to her or why. She had been a warship, and she had been killed by the enemy, and that death, however untimely, had a terrible clarity to it. The fifth Ark Royal's end was a different kind of thing. She was not sunk. She was cancelled, removed from service by a defence review that decided, in a document produced in October of 2010, that the Royal Navy could not afford to operate her alongside the transition to the Queen Elizabeth-class carriers that were then under construction. The Strategic Defence and Security Review of 2010, conducted against the backdrop of the most severe British public spending crisis since the 1970s, produced a series of decisions about defence capability that were controversial in the moment and have remained contested by military analysts and naval historians ever since. The fifth Ark Royal was one of its most prominent casualties. The review decided that the transition to the new Queen Elizabeth-class carriers could be managed without maintaining the Invincible class in service, that there was sufficient overlap planned between the older ships, decommissioning, and the new carriers commissioning to avoid a gap in carrier capability. This proved to be an optimistic assessment. The gap it was supposed to prevent was, in the event, not prevented. Britain went without an operational carrier deck for a period of years that the planners had hoped to avoid. The announcement that HMS Ark Royal would be decommissioned immediately ahead of her planned service life came on the 19th of October, 2010, the same day the Defence Review was published. The ship had been on operations as recently as months before. She was operational, serviceable, and crewed by men and women who had no advance warning that the decision had been made. The news came to the ship's company as news comes in the modern era through media and official channels simultaneously, the institutional announcement arriving in close proximity to the first news reports that appeared before the official communication had fully reached every member of the crew. The reaction aboard was, by accounts from those present, one of shock mixed with professional resignation. They were members of the armed forces. Decisions about force structure were made by civilians, and those decisions were final. The decommissioning ceremony was held on the 11th of March, 2011. The fifth Ark Royal was paid off at Portsmouth, her ensign lowered for the last time in the presence of her ship's company, naval dignitaries, veterans, and members of the public who had come to mark the occasion. There was no enemy in this ending. There was no enemy to blame, and no heroism in the conventional military sense to celebrate. There was simply a ship coming to the end of her service, carrying a name that was too important to be treated as merely administrative, in a ceremony that tried to honour both the specific ship and the long lineage of ships she represented. The veterans of earlier Ark Royals who were present at the decommissioning ceremony carried within them a perspective that the serving officers and ratings could appreciate but not fully share. A man who had served aboard the third Ark Royal, and in 2011 there was still a very small number of such men alive, watching the Fifth Ark Royal's colours come down, who was watching the continuation of something he had contributed to in circumstances quite different. He had served in a war. He had survived a torpedo, a sinking, a rescue in the Mediterranean winter. The ship he had served aboard lay on the seabed east of Gibraltar. And now, 70 years later, another ship bearing the same name was being paid off in a peacetime ceremony at Portsmouth. The emotional texture of that moment is not something that can be fully reconstructed in words. It can only be acknowledged. The disposal of the Fifth Ark Royal followed the decommissioning. She was sold for recycling in 2013 and was broken up at a facility in Turkey. The breaking of a warship is a necessary and unsentimental process. The steel is recovered, the machinery is either reused or scrapped. The spaces that were once inhabited by thousands of people are dismantled section by section until there is nothing left that resembles a ship. The name does not go with the steel. The name, as always, survives. But the physical object, the particular arrangement of corridors and compartments and flight decks and engine rooms that had been HMS Ark Royal Row 7 ceased to exist. It became raw material. What was history became industrial input. There is a recurring pattern in how human beings respond to the disposal of ships that they have served aboard or that have played a significant role in national history. There is a lobby for preservation, the argument that some ships should be kept, maintained as museums, as physical connections to the past that no document or film or exhibition can fully replicate. HMS Belfast, moored on the Thames in London as a museum ship, is one expression of this argument. HMS Victory in Portsmouth Dry Dock is another. For HMS Ark Royal, both the third and the fifth, no such preservation was achieved. The third went too quickly, sinking before any thought of preservation was possible. The fifth was sold for scrap in circumstances that did not allow time for the alternatives to be fully developed. The argument that she should have been preserved, that a ship bearing that name, with that history, deserved a better fate than the breaker's yard, was made by veterans, by naval enthusiasts, and by a public petition that gathered significant signatures but ultimately did not change the outcome. What was preserved, in the absence of the physical ship, was the record. The photographs, the operational logs, the personal accounts of service, the technical documents, the inquiry records, the memory, all of these persisted and continue to persist in archives and collections and in the minds of the men and women who served. The Imperial War Museum holds material related to the Ark Royals across several generations. The National Archives holds the official record. Countless private collections hold the personal record, the photographs taken on flight decks, the diaries kept in the mess decks, the letters written home from sea that described, in the careful language of people who knew their mail was censored, what it actually felt like to be there. This is, in the end, what history is made of. Not the grand narrative, though the grand narrative has its value, but the accumulation of the specific and the personal. The man who noted in his diary on the 14th of November 1941 that he had come ashore at Gibraltar carrying a bag of personal possessions and the knowledge that his ship was on the bottom of the sea. The woman who served as an engineer officer on the Fifth Ark Royal and kept a photograph of the ship above her desk for the rest of her working life. The rating who carved HMS Ark Royal into the frame of his bunk and left it there for the next man. These are the real substance of the story. Everything else, the battles, the exercises, the political decisions, the design specifications exists to explain the context in which those people lived, those moments. And still the name was not finished. A new generation of carriers was being built. The Queen Elizabeth class was taking shape in yards across Britain. And when the time came to name the second ship of that class, when the Royal Navy looked at what it had built and reached for the name that would connect it most directly to 4.5 centuries of the most important lineage in British naval history, there was only one name available. HMS Prince of Wales would sail, but so, once more, with the idea of Ark Royal, the name cannot be sunk. Chapter 17. The Queen Elizabeth class and the return of British carrier power. The construction of HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales was an act of institutional faith in a period that did not make such acts easy. The program that produced these two carriers had been authorized in principle by the Strategic Defense Review of 1998, which recommended that Britain build two new large carriers capable of operating the Joint Strike Fighter, the multi-role aircraft then being developed jointly with the United States. The carriers would be conventionally powered, would use a ski jump and short takeoff and vertical landing aircraft configuration rather than catapults and conventional arrested landing, and would be large enough to operate a meaningful air group under genuine carrier strike conditions. The design was approved, the contracts were signed, and then the program was subjected to a decade of delays, design changes, cost increases, and political second-guessing that tested the patience of everyone involved with a thoroughness that the shipbuilders would have preferred to avoid. The final ships that emerged from this process were substantially larger than anything the Royal Navy had previously operated. HMS Queen Elizabeth, the first of the class, displaced approximately 65,000 tons at full load, larger than any previous British warship, larger than the United States Navy's Midway-class carriers of the Cold War era, in the same weight class as the American Kitty Hawk-class, conventionally powered carriers that had defined fleet carrier capability through the 1970s and 80s. She was 284 meters in length, with a flight deck area of roughly 13,000 square meters, capable of operating up to 40 aircraft with a flight deck crew and air group totaling somewhere in the range of 700 personnel, within a total ship's complement of around 1,600. The numbers were a return to the scale of capability that had not been available to the Royal Navy since the fourth Ark Royal paid off in 1978. The aircraft for which both carriers were designed was the Lockheed Martin 35B, the short takeoff and vertical landing variant of the fifth-generation stealth fighter that the United Kingdom had committed to as part of the Joint Strike Fighter program. The F-35B was in a completely different performance and capability category from the Sea Harrier that had been the primary fixed-wing aircraft of the Invincible class. It was a supersonic, radar-evading, sensor-fused combat aircraft with the situational awareness and weapons carriage of a design that was, in almost every measurable category, the most capable aircraft ever intended to operate from a British carrier. Its integration with the Queen Elizabeth class, the development of the procedures, the training standards, the maintenance protocols, and the tactical doctrine for operating it from these ships was the central challenge of British carrier aviation in the first decades of the 21st century. HMS Queen Elizabeth was commissioned on the 7th of December 2017 in a ceremony at Portsmouth, presided over by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The symbolism of a monarch commissioning a ship bearing her name was noted, as was the connection to the long history of the Ark Royal lineage with which the Queen Elizabeth class would share the Royal Navy's carrier force. HMS Prince of Wales, commissioned in 2019. Together, the two ships represented Britain's return to a carrier capability that had been absent in its full form for 4 decades. The return was not uncontroversial. The costs of the program had risen substantially from the original estimates, and the arguments about whether two large carriers represented the most efficient use of the defense budget were not silenced by the ship's commissioning. They continued, as arguments about defense expenditure always continue, adapting their form as the geopolitical environment changed around them. The fifth Ark Royal was gone by the time her successors entered service. The gap between the fifth Ark Royal's decommissioning in 2011 and HMS Queen Elizabeth's commissioning in 2017 was 6 years without an operational carrier deck, the gap that the 2010 Defence Review had nominally planned to avoid. The debate about whether that gap had cost Britain operationally, whether there were situations between 2011 and 2017 in which carrier capability would have been employed and was not available, is one that military analysts have continued to examine. Libya in 2011 was frequently cited British air operations in support of the intervention against the Gaddafi government had to be conducted from land bases and from a French carrier because Britain had no carrier of its own available. The gap was real, and it had consequences, even if those consequences were difficult to measure precisely. HMS Queen Elizabeth's first operational deployment with an embarked F-35B squadron took place in 2021, a deployment to the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific that demonstrated both the capability of the new carrier strike group and the diplomatic and military relationships through which Britain intended to deploy that capability. The carrier operated alongside American, Dutch, and other Allied warships, conducted air operations over Afghanistan in the final stages of the NATO presence there, passed through the South China Sea in a deliberate demonstration of freedom of navigation, and returned to Portsmouth having covered more than 45,000 nautical miles. It was the first British carrier strike deployment of that scale and ambition since the Fourth Ark Royal's era, and it was watched with close attention both by those who had argued for the Queen Elizabeth class and by those who had questioned whether Britain retained the operational expertise and the logistical capacity to conduct such operations. After 4 decades of reduced capability, the response to that first deployment was, by the measured standards of defence analysis, positive. The carrier strike group had operated effectively in multiple environments. The F-35B had performed at or above expectations. The Allied interoperability that had been one of the programme's design goals was demonstrated in practice, and the geopolitical signals sent by passing through contested waters had been, at minimum, clearly received. None of this proved that the carriers would perform at this level under sustained combat conditions. Only combat can prove that, but the professional assessment was that the Royal Navy had successfully regenerated a genuine carrier strike capability after the long interruption of the Invincible class years. The question of what role the name Ark Royal would play in the Queen Elizabeth class era was left deliberately open for a period. There were discussions at various points about naming future vessels or future conversions with the name. The name itself remained in the Royal Navy's official reserve of honoured ship names, the list of designations so important to British naval history that they are maintained against future use rather than allowed to lapse. That list is not long. Ark Royal is on it, as it has been, in one form or another since the 16th century. When the Royal Navy next decides to commission a vessel of sufficient significance to warrant one of its most honoured names, the name will be available. The 4th century of Ark Royal's service, if we count from the first galleon's commission in 1587, is still in progress as this account is being written. The ships that carry on the legacy are not yet finished making their mark. The sea that has taken 3 of the ships bearing this name and worn out 2 more has not changed in any fundamental respect. It remains cold and deep and entirely indifferent to the names painted on the hulls that cross it. The meaning comes from the people and the decisions and the moments of courage and error and professional commitment that occur on every ship that goes to sea in earnest. Ark Royal's meaning is 400 years deep and still accumulating. Chapter 18. The name, the sea, and the long account. History does not end. It pauses and then continues under a different heading. What we have been tracing through these chapters is not simply the biography of a series of ships. It is the biography of an idea, the idea that Britain is a maritime nation, that its security and prosperity depend upon the ability to project power from the sea, that the carriers which make that projection possible are worth building and maintaining and fighting to preserve in the face of every budget review and strategic reassessment and peacetime skepticism that the management of a democracy generates. The Ark Royals, all of them, from the Elizabethan galleon to the 21st century carrier, are the physical expression of that idea across 4 centuries. The idea has been more durable than any of the ships that expressed it. They were all, in the end, temporary. The idea persists. The 3rd Ark Royal, the carrier, the one whose story forms the spine of this documentary, died at 43 months of operational service. Measured against the 4-century tradition she carried, 43 months is a brief tenure. But the measure of a ship's historical significance is not its service life, but the weight of what it accomplished within that life, and measured in those terms, the 3rd Ark Royal was extraordinary. She entered service at the beginning of the worst war in human history. She participated in operations that spanned 3 oceans and touched every major theatre of the war's first 2 years. She survived repeated attempts by Germany's propaganda machine to kill her rhetorically before Germany's actual military assets could kill her physically. She delivered the blow that stopped the Bismarck. And she died, not from enemy action in the conventional sense, but from a single torpedo and a flooding sequence that better preparation might have prevented a death that was, in its mechanical analysis, avoidable, and that has been teaching damage control officers ever since. The men who sailed her deserve more than a paragraph in an account of this kind, but the limitations of any narrative mean that individual human beings inevitably blur into the collective noun of the crew or the ship's company. They should not be entirely lost in that abstraction. They were specific people, with specific names and faces and histories and futures, who happened to serve aboard this particular ship during this particular period of history. The pilot who launched from a pitching deck into a North Atlantic storm to find the Bismarck was a man with a name and a family and a fear that he managed professionally and a courage that he would probably have described, if asked, in terms considerably more modest than the word demands. The engineer who worked through the night in flooding compartments on the 14th of November, trying to save a ship that could not be saved, was doing something that requires a quality of dedication that the word duty only partially captures. These men earned their place in the account that has been given here, and the inadequacy of language to fully honour them is one of the persistent frustrations of the historian's task. The wreck of the Third Ark Royal still lies at the bottom of the Mediterranean, roughly 50 kilometres west of Gibraltar, in approximately 1,015 metres of water. She is protected under the Protection of Military Remains Act of 1986 as a protected place, the designation that the British government applies to the wrecks of Royal Navy vessels that are considered war. Graves. The bodies of the 27 men who did not come ashore at Gibraltar, 1 killed in the original torpedo strike, 26 lost in the subsequent hours, are presumed to remain with the wreck. The survey that located and photographed her in 2002 treated the site with the appropriate solemnity, and the footage that was subsequently broadcast showed a wreck that remained, even after 6 decades on the seabed, clearly and unmistakably a carrier, the flight deck angled against the seafloor, the island structure identifiable, the hull structure largely intact. She did not look like a ruin, she looked like a ship that was resting. The Mediterranean itself has changed since 1941 in every respect except its geography and its depth. The politics of the nations around it have changed beyond recognition. The strategic significance of its sea lanes has changed. The technologies deployed on its surface and beneath it have changed beyond the comprehension of the officers who navigated its waters in the second year of the Second World War. What has not changed is the basic challenge of maritime power, the challenge of putting ships into waters that are contested, maintaining them there in the face of determined opposition, and using them to achieve objectives that cannot be achieved any other way. That challenge was the same for Lord Howard in the Channel in 1588 as it was for Vice Admiral Somerville in Force H in 1941. It remains the same challenge for the officers commanding HMS Queen Elizabeth in the 21st century. The technology changes. The geography and the fundamental nature of what it means to project power from the sea does not. There is a ceremony performed by every Royal Navy carrier that deserves mention as a concluding note to this account. When a new vessel is commissioned with a name that has been borne by a previous ship, there is a tradition of transferring the ship's bell, the physical bell, if it has been preserved, from the old vessel to the new. The ship's bell is, in Royal Navy tradition, the most symbolically significant object aboard a warship. It marks the hours. It is used in christening ceremonies for children of the ship's company born at sea. Its loss, in battle or shipwreck, is treated as the most final kind of loss a ship can suffer, the symbolic equivalent of the colours being struck. The bells of the Ark Royals are preserved in various collections and institutions. The bell of the Third Ark Royal, the carrier, the Bismarck Hunter, the Mediterranean Fighter, is in the care of the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton in Somerset, where it can be seen by anyone who travels there to look at it. It is a plain thing in the way that all ships' bells are plain things polished bronze, with the ship's name and date cast into it, functional and undecorated. It does not look like a monument. It does not look like the sort of object around which history accretes. But hold it in mind for a moment, this object that rang the hours aboard a ship that launched the aircraft, that stopped the Bismarck, that rang through the Malta Club runs and the Norwegian campaign, and the Mers El Kabir operations, and the long months of Mediterranean patrol, and all the ordinary days of wartime service that surround and support the moments that history remembers. Every watch that was changed aboard the Third Ark Royal was changed at the sound of this bell. Every alarm, every alert, every turn of the clock through 43 months of war was marked by it. It rang above the Atlantic and above the Mediterranean, and it rang on the 14th of November, 1941, as the ship was going down and the men were coming off, and then it was recovered and brought ashore, and it has been silent in a museum ever since. The name, unlike the bell, has not been silent. It has gone on. It will go on. There will be, at some point, a sixth Ark Royal. The Royal Navy has a way of arriving back at its most important names when the time comes for them, when the moment demands the weight that only a great name can carry. It will be a different ship, in a different era, operated by people whose relationship to the sea and to naval warfare will have been shaped by technologies and strategic realities that we cannot yet fully see. But it will carry the same lineage. The Elizabethan galleon is in it, the carrier that stopped the Bismarck is in it, every ship that has borne the name between those two and after them is in it. The sea remembers nothing. It receives everything, dissolves everything, returns nothing but salt. The sea does not carry memory, it only carries ships, and not always safely, and not always for long. The memory is carried by people, and by institutions, and by the particular human habit of giving names to things we want to preserve, not the things themselves, but the meaning of the things, the weight and the significance, and the courage and the cost. HMS Ark Royal is a name that has been carrying meaning for 400 years and will carry it for 400 more, whatever hull it happens to be attached to and whatever sea that hull happens to be sailing. The Atlantic is dark tonight and the Mediterranean is quiet, and somewhere in the deep water east of Gibraltar, resting on its starboard side in the cold and the dark and the complete silence of 900 meters of seawater, there is a flight deck. You could lower a vessel on a wire down to it, shine a light on it, and see the space where the aircraft stood. The aircraft are long gone, of course. The men are long gone. The sound and the fury and the urgency of it all are gone, but the flight deck is still there. And if you knew what you were looking at, if you knew the specific weight of history that rested in that particular piece of steel, in that particular depth of water, you would know that you were looking at a place where the world changed very slightly in November of 1941, and where it is still, in the cold and the silence, changing. That is where we leave her, not in a museum, not in a ceremony, not in a document, or a photograph, or a list of battle honours. At the bottom of the sea that she sailed, in the waters that she fought for, in the place where the name Ark Royal earned its final and most enduring meaning. Good night, sleep well. The watch is set, and the sea is being kept. And that is the complete history of HMS Ark Royal, Britain's most famous carrier. If you made it all the way through, whether you stayed awake or drifted in and out with history washing over you, thank you. That is exactly what this channel is for. If this was your first time here, please subscribe, because there is a great deal more history where this came from, told the same way, at the same pace, with the same care. Long-form, factual, cinematic, and made for the hours when the world goes quiet and the only thing that makes sense is a good story, told slowly and told properly. We will see you on the next one.